My entire life has revolved around the infrastructure that lay beneath our feet. My father and our generations before him all bore the same responsibility, maintaining the city's arteries. I know the labyrinthine storm drain system that sits below us better than my own home. It had rained heavily over the last week, so when my phone buzzed in the morning, I already knew what it was about. The council called me in a panic about flooding in the industrial area, admittedly less maintained than the residential systems, and begged me to check it out. Their frantic tone was lost on me, because I was expecting this to happen. Another day at the job. I grabbed my gear, which was well maintained but worn out from years of use, and I slipped a pack of Lucky Strikes into my pocket, a habit I'd never been able to kick, and headed on my way. Stepping out of my truck, I tightened my gloves, secured my boots, and started trudging down the old path toward the northeastern entrance. The opening to the drain was a gaping hole in the earth, the city's very maw that seemed prepared to swallow just about anything whole. The first glaring thing I noticed was the high water levels in the tunnel, soaking my boots as I waded in. I expected water, but I didn't expect a small fire pit, still smouldering slightly near the entrance. The thought of homeless people in the drains crossed my mind, and it wasn't a comforting thought. I'd seen this before. The vagabonds that took refuge in drains in this area were notoriously nasty. I grabbed my pack of Lucky Strikes and lit a cigarette to calm myself for a potential confrontation. As I entered, I noticed just how deep the water went. I grabbed my flood gauge to measure the water level. I had to know the exact number before making any further assessments. 11 inches above road level, 5 inches more than what it should be. I grabbed my notebook and jotted down the numbers. I compared it to my previous measurements of this area, which was abnormal. I constantly kept meticulous notes, so I checked further back to see if there had been any incidents like this before, but this was the first time it had reached these levels. No minor issue would cause the water level to almost double like this, so I knew I had to make my way in and diagnose the situation immediately. Due to the flooding, I had to ensure the air was breathable. With potential damage to the systems, leaks from the sewage could cause a plethora of gases to build up. So I pulled out my handheld gas detector and ventured a little further into the tunnels, flashlight in hand. Further in, the air was thick. The scent of decay and mildew lingered. I scanned the walls for any signs of a potential cause of the over-the-top flooding, but I saw nothing apart from some graffiti and moss along the walls. I grabbed my multi-tool from my left side and tapped it on the wall for a few brief moments. Sometimes water would leak out between the tunnels, causing a slight shifting and misalignment of the entire system, which alone caused a myriad of issues. The walls sounded more hollow than they should, and I briefly stepped out to grab my laser distance device. I had to check for slight shifts in the path. The results yielded what I had already known, a moderate shift and a slight sag. But knowing the exact numbers could help me find the root of the issues, so I added another entry into my almost full notebook. The deeper I ventured, the more the sound of rain and the city bustling faded. Now, the most prominent sounds were the slight rumblings from the industrial machines above. This was just more proof of the state of the tunnel I was in. I didn't remember them being this pronounced when I was last here, and I figured the tunnel shift caused pockets for the walls to vibrate more. I used chalk to mark the route I had taken. It was already lined with previous marks made by me, and despite feeling confident about knowing my way around, marking my way was a habit my grandfather had drilled into me. I found a nice fork in my path and figured I was finally deep enough to check the gas levels. The little handheld device beat to life. I had to be aware of anything that could harm me if I went deeper. Methane showed 150 ppmv, fairly normal for being this deep into a drain. Hydrogen sulfide registered at 4 ppmv, which wouldn't affect me too much as long as I didn't stick around too long. But the odd thing was the high levels of carbon monoxide. This meant I had to be careful with how much I exerted myself. I wasn't quite sure why the levels were so high, but I was at least confident I could explore more to find out. I arrived at the red maintenance room door and went to check the pressure gauges. The gauge readings were all over the place, which either alluded to a massive blockage, or worse, a crack in the infrastructure. The strangest readings were towards the north-northwest, so now I knew where I had to head. The path towards the north-northwest line proved my suspicions correct. The water level fluctuated and the flow seemed to slow down, a telltale sign of a blockage. The rumbling was getting louder now. I knew I was getting close to the source of the problem. This was made more apparent by the shaking of the cement around me. The infrastructure was weaker here. As I rounded the corner, I finally encountered the issue. A sizable amount of rubble was in the way, creating a makeshift dam and a hole in the wall. I noted more information before approaching the scene. The wall seemed to have been blown out by force. Pressure built up from somewhere on the other side of the wall and blew inwards. There was no other way for the rubble to end up inside the tunnel in the manner that it did. I approached the hole in the wall itself and shined my flashlight through. It was bigger than if the concrete had just crumbled. It was damn near half my size. I expected to see a pocket of dirt, possibly a gap from the tunnel shifting, which caused pressure to blow inwards. What I didn't expect was an entirely different tunnel system. This hidden tunnel seemed to be entirely walled with compressed dirt rather than concrete, which showed that it wasn't just another symmetrical tunnel or an older abandoned one. I took my notebook out and read through the things I had already written down, wondering if I might have information on this. By all means, I could have just made my way out, planned with my team and the city council, and worked through this more prepared. But those damn assholes would make me file countless reports on this before I even stepped foot back in. It would take weeks just to get the repair schedule, and this would come after countless days of surveying. From the gases to the numbers in the pressure gauges and the shift in the tunnel's layout, it wasn't ridiculous to say that everything could get worse, fast, without proper intervention, or at least finding the underlying issues as soon as possible. And even if the repairs got underway promptly, undoubtedly, our city's cheap bureaucracy would do no more than seal up the hole, only to have it break again, or worse in the future. Ultimately, I decided I would go inside the hole, if only briefly. My idea was to poke around to get enough evidence which would hopefully convince the higher-ups that the repairs of the tunnel shouldn't just be superficial. This way, they couldn't just declare the hole to be patched up and pretend nothing else was wrong. I braced myself and crawled inside. The first thing that hit me was the smell. The air was thicker, with a faint earthly scent and something metallic. I ran my hand along the walls of the dirt tunnel. I glanced over my shoulder, and the dim light from the hole barely penetrated the darkness around me. So I clicked my flashlight on and looked around. There were jagged marks left by whatever tools had been used to gouge it out. This wasn't the work of modern machinery. These tunnels had an older feeling, like they had been dug out by pickaxes or something more archaic. Then the rumbling came again. In here, however, surrounded by dirt, the sound was more muffled, but the impact of the shaking was much more present. The earth around me shook, causing little bits and pieces to fall off the ceiling. But the tunnel held. Whatever machinery was being used in the industrial area above must have been heavy duty for it to be felt on the soft dirt of the tunnel. Getting a good sense of my surroundings, I moved deeper into the tunnel. With each step, the tunnel sloped gently downward. The floor was uneven and littered with loose dirt and small stones. I started mentally mapping the path I was taking. So far, it was following perpendicular to the storm drain, but I wasn't sure how long that would be the case for, and I sure as hell wasn't about to get myself lost. I periodically paused to mark the walls using my multi-tool. It took more effort than expected. The earth had been packed so hard that immense pressure must have been used while digging this tunnel out. At least it meant the tunnel had some structural integrity, seeing as there weren't any support beams left after its construction. As I ventured further, I noticed the tunnel's dimensions were strangely irregular. They sometimes narrowed and other times they widened. I grabbed my distance measurer and the numbers confirmed my suspicions. This was not a professionally dug out or well-planned tunnel. This raised more questions on top of the many that were already piling on. Next, I flicked the gas detector on. The numbers showed higher levels of methane and significantly lower levels of carbon monoxide. I grabbed my notebook once more and started writing the numbers down. But then, in the middle of my writing, the rumble started again. This time, it was different. It was no longer just a muffled reverberation. I could feel it more in my feet. And now, it was rhythmic. Thump, thump, thump. It was louder now, and it echoed. A pulsing thrum that vibrated through the dirt. The ground beneath my boots felt unstable, as if the very earth could shift at any moment. And it wasn't just getting louder. No. It was getting closer. Behind me. I didn't want to waste time turning around. Instinct took over, screaming at me to get away. I dropped my notebook and made a run for it. The tunnel, already constricting at the seams, seemed to grow even smaller as I tore through the darkness. The beam of my flashlight flung around wildly as the thudding behind me grew louder. The thing behind me was matching my pace. The tunnel wasn't just vibrating now. It was shaking, as if whatever was behind me threatened to collapse it entirely. I slid and skidded on loose dirt, almost losing my footing. I fought to keep my breath consistent in the dense tunnel air. My heart beat loudly in my ears, drowning out everything but the thing's relentless approach. I reached the fork in the tunnel and did not hesitate for a moment. With no time to lose, I instantly veered left, the narrow passage forcing me to duck slightly. The rumbling behind me grew distant for the slightest of moments, as if it had miscalculated the turn. It gave me an inkling of hope, but I knew I wasn't out of it yet. I needed an exit, and I needed it fast. I'd put some distance between me and whatever was behind me, but I was also further away from the only exit I knew of. The tunnel twisted and turned now, no longer straight and coordinated. It was now serpentine in nature. Its pace kept up with me on long straights. The earth ground, as whatever it was, worked its way down corridors. However, it slowed down on turns. Knowing this, I darted to the side every chance I got, and eventually, the distance widened so much that I could barely hear it. The only downside was that I was almost entirely lost. Sure, I prided myself on tracking my turns perfectly in the storm drain tunnels. It was borderline mandatory for the job. But in the rush, I did not have the luxury to take detailed mental notes on my directions. My only saving grace was that I had a general idea of the cardinal direction I had moved, so my only option was to head back in one general direction and hope no turns deviated me too much. I calmly backtracked. Without the urgency of escape, I had time to think on the situation. Whatever had chased me must have been a machine I'd never seen before. Without the sporadic nature of the tunnels it left behind, it was too asymmetrical and erratic to be a new storm drain system. The nature of these tunnels was just as confusing as when I'd found them. Despite this, I couldn't be mad at the person operating the machine. Regardless of my opinions on the mess they were making here, it was my fault that I'd stumbled into a live construction site. However, I could be mad that they had carelessly damaged the storm drain system that neighboured their project. My priority was to make contact with whoever was working these new tunnels to stop current operations for me to get out safely. I followed imprints of my running footprints back as well as I could and made educated guesses for times that I lost my tracks. I would always seem to circle back to my tracks, which made me thankful for the sense of direction drilled into me by my grandfather. As I made progress, I heard a low rumble. It sounded like an idle engine, though it was rhythmic, not a static hum. It was a slight deviation from my path, but to ensure my safety, I detoured towards it, hoping to make contact to tell them to cease operations while I made my way out, and to secretly get the name of the company that was going to be my new nemesis as soon as I got out. I reached the fork, the hum reverberating from the right, so I called out, loudly, in case the engine drowned out my cries. I heard nothing back, so for my safety, I slowed my pace to a crawl, calling out incessantly to no avail. The worker must have been ignorant to a passing vagrant in the tunnels, which part of me couldn't blame him for, as the situation was very bizarre, but frustrated me to no end. As I peeked my head around the corner, I slowly brought my arm around to try flash my light into the cabin of the machine. If they couldn't hear me, there was no way they could miss my light. Fur. Instead of a luminescent paint job on hardened steel, I saw disheveled fur, legs poking out with long, concaved claws, perfect for digging, perfect for tunneling. It shuffled more, its breathing hums rumbling more erratically as it knew I was near. To my amazing luck, I saw no head. I was behind it, and whatever this creature was, it had no way to turn around or reverse. Its frustration was projected from its increased breathing and grunting. My shock held me as I looked it over, and despite how much I racked my brain over the many animals I knew of, nothing in the world came close to whatever this was. It was huge, leaving almost no space around it. The tunnel was a perfect fit around it, tailor-made for it to move through, and seeing the size of the tunnel, I was astonished that a creature so big could exist. While I was looking over its strange tail, it suddenly darted off. Despite its size, it moved fast, its claws digging deep with a recognizable thump each time and pulling it forward at a surprising pace. It veered left and shuffled away. This wasn't the reprise I was hoping for, as I heard it turn, then turn again, and soon I heard it getting louder, but from my left. It was circling around, and I did not want to hang around long enough to see its front end. Its behavior told me that seeing it up close would be a death sentence, so adrenaline took over as I turned and ran. I tried to line back up to where I'd been backtracking before, but in the rush, I did not have the luxury of studying the ground for footprints. Like before, it gained on me on the straights, and I created distance on the turns. But each turn twisted my sense of direction until I was utterly turned around, just rushing through the dark to find safety. But I found something else instead. I had created a good distance between the creature, but not enough for it to lose its chase, and in front of me was a wall of dirt, a dead end. The scraping told me it had tunneled up to this point and stopped, and the concrete behind some gashes told me it had reached the storm drain tunnels and couldn't get through. All that went through my mind was if I could make it to the last turn I made to continue this game of cat and mouse. I turned to run back and try, but I stumbled and slipped on loose dirt, barely catching myself before I fell. The beam of my flashlight flickered on and off, casting shadows on the wall. I paused for a moment to steady my hand. That small bit of wasted time was all it took. I was too late. I heard it approaching the turn ahead, and with its pace, there was no way for me to return to the crossroads on time. The straight was too far for me to beat it to the turn, and even if I did, I would be on another straight with it just meters behind me, too close to beat it until the next turn. It was over. I could die in vain, or I could go out on my own terms, and a wash of serenity came over me surprisingly quickly as I just accepted the situation. I slumped down on a mound of loose dirt, got comfortable, and pulled out the lucky stripes I'd stashed in my front pocket. Smoking in a tunnel was forbidden for obvious reasons, but my final act was to stick it to the rules and do something I'd always wanted to do. I lit the flame of the lighter, briefly illuminating the tunnel in which I now sat. The first drag was harsh. The smoke caught in my throat and scratched relentlessly, but the buzz was the best mental reprieve from the incoming doom, a final moment of bliss before the end. The rumbling approached, nearing the final corner before the long straight to my dead end. The air thickened with the smoke as I rushed another hit, trying to see if I could at least finish it before it reached me. It seemed I was allowed some extra time as it slowed. Either it was savoring the moment, or it knew I was in a dead end. Either way, I was fortunate in an unfortunate way. So I continued to savor my final act. To prepare myself, I just focused on the cigarette, staring at the red embers that lit up as I drew it in, trying to push the thoughts of a violent death to the back of my mind. Never gone, but far enough away to try find some last-second peace. As the red reached the tip of the butt, I felt a nauseating sense of finality. I'd associated the end of the cigarette with the end of my life. But as I slowly came to, back in the moment, I was holding the smouldering remains of the cigarette, in silence. Smoke blocked the beam of light from my flashlight, one of the many reasons we're not allowed to smoke while on the job. The stale air was replaced by the strong smell of nicotine, and my vision barely passed a few feet. This would typically instill a sense of claustrophobia, but all I could think about was the creature, unmoving, just out of vision. Having somewhat accepted my peace, I took a few paces forward, away from the dead end to see if it was still there. And as I approached, shuffling mirrored my movement. It groaned as it shuffled away in the same direction I was heading. I walked more, emerging from the cloud I'd created. And there it was. My light didn't penetrate far enough to see it in its entirety, but it illuminated enough to see two pinprick eyes, like a cat caught in headlights in the dead of night. Growls rumbled as it dared approaching slowly. In the high of the moment, I pieced together what was happening. I pulled out another cigarette, lit it up, and blew the smoke around. I lost sight of it, but I could hear it defiantly moving back. I edged forward step by step, creating a cloud around me and I heard it bump into the wall of the turn and scramble to the side. As soon as it reared the bend, it shuffled forward and sped away. Everything that had transpired left me confused. So many questions swirled around my mind, but I had to focus on the one absolute truth about the situation. I was given a chance to escape, and I had to take it. I moved through the tunnels, lit cigarette in hand. I tried not to smoke it too much, as each puff left me blinded for a short period, and I had a finite amount of cigarettes. But anytime I heard the thumping nearby, I let out a few exhales of smoke, and it would edge away, always near but never approaching. With the downtime, I was able to find the remnants of some of my stomped footprints, and I used the indent of my sprinting heel imprints to slowly track back to where I was. Eventually, I saw something that stood out of the dirt, just sticking out by a corner and a bit torn. My notebook, which seemed to have been scratched up but otherwise intact. I was ecstatic. I hadn't dropped it too far from the exit, which was important to me, so I snatched it up, getting my bearings on the last distance to the exit. But then, another sensation hit me. The space between my fingers burned ever so slightly as the cigarette came to its end. Then, as if on cue, thump, thump, thump. The rumbling thumping reappeared, this time hurried, angry. Either it was frustrated at being teased by its food always moving away, or it knew I was nearing the exit. The walls around me shook and debris landed all around me. I ran like hell. Everything reached a crescendo. The creature shook the earth as it pummeled through the tunnel toward me, and I could tell it was gaining ground fast. But I was just fast enough. I cut my back up diving through the hole, just making it through as something sharp swiped at where I was. The pain was dulled by the rush of adrenaline that fueled my last dash for freedom. I could hear the concrete get scraped away, and the wall reverberated with the harsh sound of it trying to get through. I was soaked on the floor, landing on the flooding and rubble on the other side. I grabbed some debris and threw it at the hole, desperate to either hit it or block it up as best I could. But I knew it was a job too much for one man. Once the smell of dampness wore off, I smelled something new. Smoke. At first, I thought it was my clothing, probably stained from the smell of cigarettes I had just gone through, but it was strong and smelled distinct, more earthen. It coincided with my walk out. Following the route I took and hearing the rain from outside, I made my way to the exit, and my eyes watered, not from relief, but from the smoke being blasted towards me. I had to cover my face with my sleeve as I went down the final straight, and when I could finally see again, I saw what was causing all the smoke. The barrel at the front, which I thought was just a fire for the homeless, was lit with a fresh flame, a mix of dry wood for fuel and wet leaves for smoke. It wafted through the storm-drained tunnels with fervour from the strong winds. Once outside, I felt a new sense of urgency, a feeling to relish my freedom, but also to take action. I ran back to my truck and dialed the city council. I made arrangements for repairs, making no mention of the tunnels I had found. I explained I found a hole, but that the gases from the earth were leaking through. That way, the people who go in won't need to enter the other side and would wear enough protection to obscure their vision. The less curiosity, the better. Over the coming weeks, in preparation, I kept the fire lit like clockwork. I've never crossed paths with whoever's been lighting it before, or when I was in there, but they exist. Some days I go to light it, only to see someone has beaten me to it. Whoever it was seemed to know about the creature before me and seemed to appreciate my joining their efforts, once leaving a thank you note on the barrel for me. When the time came for repairs, I waited for the boys to go inside the tunnels, watching them glance at the fire as they went past. They tried to kick up a fuss about it, obviously being a hazard for them to work in the tunnels, but I managed to spit enough jargon about the necessity of it. They knew about construction, but I knew enough buzzwords about storm drain infrastructure to bold-faced lie about the need for the fire. They never knew that it was my only hope of keeping whatever was inside far away from them. The entire time they made those repairs, I stood outside vigilantly, keeping the fire ablaze. And once they walked out, I lied that I would set it out once they left. I've been in the tunnels since the incident. I checked and saw it was still solid, but while doing my inspections, I sometimes still hear it. I no longer think it's the machines from the industrial area above. I recognize its movement patterns all too well now. We're safe from it breaking through the solid concrete. For now. But I still go by every so often and keep the fire lit, just in case it ever gets through again. I live under the greatest horror known to man, the Homeowners Association. The scrutiny of their esoteric rules is benign only to them. You may hear tales of HOAs that are sticklers to strict laws, but let me tell you that mine is far worse. I once saw them cite an old lady for undesirable decorations on her house. They were napkins that were blown around a porch after a barbecue. Driving through the streets, the neighborhood almost looks like a movie set. Within minutes of being expressed, all sense of personality is crushed. Still, I moved here at a much better price than if I lived in the city. I have more space too. For the cost of my house, I would be living in a small studio apartment that I wouldn't even own. So, I put up with the HOA simply by almost never being at home. The only downside for me is the commute. I have to travel far to get to work, and even further if I want to do anything recreationally. But it's not too bad, knowing that I've never caused any reason to be cited. Until one day. I was sitting in my little cubicle at work when I got an email. At first I thought it might have been spam. It was a citation from the HOA that I was being written up about something. I thought this couldn't be the case since my home looked pretty much the same as when I first moved in, but I opened it anyway, just in case. My disbelief faded. It must have been real, because it had all my details that I used when I signed for the house. Through some hoity-toity nonsense speak that they were obviously using to try sound more professional than they actually were. It was a warning about a fine I'd get if I didn't clean my yard. This couldn't be the case, I thought to myself. But sure as day, there was an attached picture of a heap of mess on my lawn. It didn't look like a trash can had fallen over. The pile was of large pieces of junk containing a mixture of broken furniture and discarded housing materials. Furious, I quickly opened my doorbell camera feed and checked through the day. Sure enough, there it was. A dusty-looking pickup truck that pulled over, quickly launched the stuff off the back, and then sped off. Now, you'd think this would suffice, that I had good reason that it wasn't me, and that I was a victim of what looked like a random dumping. However, nothing I said absolved me of any wrongdoing. I would be fined if the site wasn't cleared by 10 p.m. that evening. Begrudgingly, I got on with work and sped back, hoping I had enough time to clear it up by the set deadline. When I pulled up to my drive, I was daunted by the task that lay ahead of me. The mound of rubble looked smaller on the wide-angle lens of my doorbell camera. In person, however, it was a heaping mountain of splintery, rusty, nail-riddled junk. I went to my shed, put on the thickest work gloves I could find, and prayed to the hepatitis gods that I wouldn't get a visit from them. Fortunately, I had a small trailer attached to the back of my car. I'd used it to move from the city all the way to this neighborhood in one trip, knowing that the cost of renting a van would have been astronomical for how little stuff I owned. I loaded piece after piece, narrowly avoiding cuts and splinters with each item hurled into the trailer. It was getting close to the deadline when I was nearly finished. Aside from a few small pieces skewed around, the last large item remained. A door inset into the lawn soil from how much weight had been on top of it. It was old looking, but not decayed, more so in the sense of its build and look. It had inset grooves that reminded me of a museum piece. Even the smell of damp soil brought out that aroma you only get from an antique shop that only stocks from the freshly deceased. The doorknob was a marred brass that had long lost this metallic luster. I tried to pry the edges with my fingers for the perch, but couldn't get between the wood and soil. Goodness knows how, but it was perfectly flush with the ground, almost like it was painted there. I grabbed a thin piece of scrap from the trailer to try prying it from the ground, at least enough for me to get my hand under. But my luck being the way it was, the piece of scrap snapped almost instantly. I stood there for a few minutes, trying to figure out what to do. I lived alone and far away from friends, so I had no one to call for a helping hand. I was put off the idea of asking a neighbor, knowing that the HOA could be any one of them, and I had no intentions of interacting with them. So I did what any man would do in this situation. I tried whatever I could think of as soon as it popped into my head. I kicked down on a corner to see if the other side would rise up an inch. Nothing. I looped a rope around the doorknob and pulled to the side, hoping it would slide out. Nothing. I even tried to see if the previous house owner had left any old tools in the shed. Nothing. The only bit of movement I got was the doorknob idea, which gave a slight, barely noticeable rise when I pulled. So, I focused on that angle and tried more ideas. If pulling to the side didn't help, maybe using it as a handle would. So I tied a rope around it and heaved upwards. The door rattled with each pull, almost like someone trying to check a locked door, but the bevel of the knob made it so my terrible tying skills were made apparent. The rope slipped off every time I felt I had a good purchase on it. This left me with my final option, to try it by hand. My grip was far from that of a rock climber, so I didn't feel confident in this, but it was worth a shot. I squatted down, gripped it with both hands, and heaved as hard as I could. That minute lift gave, but nothing more than that. Whatever this was made from must have been the heaviest wood known to man. No wonder the people ditching it didn't want to take it to the dump. Knowing that I'd somehow have to heave this into a skip was just as daunting as handling it in the moment. With a heavy huff, I gave it one last hard pull. As I adjusted my grip, the doorknob did what it was designed to do and twisted as I pulled. And as it did, I heard a familiar click. Suddenly, my ass was wet on the lawn as the door flung open. In hindsight, the thing was the weight of a normal door, that I'd forced open with all the might I could muster. This door, haphazardly left crooked on my lawn, opened, and a gust of musty air seeped from underneath. And when I stood up, I saw why. The wind whistled on the edges of the now upright door, which somehow opened into a tunnel, perfectly lined up to the angle the door had been left. I was no longer bemused by the incident. However, the swirl of emotions never settled, so I still can't quite place how I truly felt about the situation. The door sat nearly upright, just tilted far enough that it didn't immediately snap closed. But that angle was the furthest it sat. I tried pushing down on it to somehow snap it off its hinges to try get rid of it, knowing the new hole in my garden was going to have to be a future issue. But to no avail. I dared not look into the hole for a while. I was daunted by the prospect of the job. Had it breached any important pipes or wires? Was it a straight drop, which would be a danger to the neighborhood kids? What could even have made such a hole in such a short time? I hadn't seen anything that could have caused it on the video from the doorbell camera. All I saw were the workers dumping the junk in my yard. This hole was a whole new development, and something the HOA would have a field day with. When I finally peered in, something struck me as odd. On top of the oddity of the whole situation was the angle in which the hole went. It was steep, but sloped, just enough to be able to walk down, and my cell phone's flashlight didn't tickle the depths it boasted. Even sticking my arm as far as I could didn't reveal where the hole ended, though this was me lying on the edge, so I couldn't reach far. I didn't dare walk down without a plan, so that was the next step I took to figure the whole situation out. I grabbed a helmet I had stashed for the bike I never used, a flashlight I had for if the power ever went out, and a stick from the junk pile in case I needed to poke something. I was obviously inexperienced, but I didn't let this stop me from trying to scope out what I was dealing with. The door, when opened, never lay flat, standing nearly vertical, just past 90 degrees, but it held open untouched. So I slowly made my way in, using my dim flashlight to penetrate the thick darkness below. I made sure I was always in sight of the exit. However, the further I went in, the deeper it went. I took a few more cautious steps before I realized that the tunnel did not end, but rather it split in different directions. Whatever this hole was, it seemed to lead into a system of underground channels that ran much further than I planned to go. So, I had to rethink my plan. I made my way back out and put on my thinking cap. From what I saw, it was just hollowed out dirt, but my new fear was the direction one of the tunnels went. It turned towards my house, making me worry about the structural integrity. If this ran under the foundations, I would be in a world of trouble if the unsupported hollows fell through. I decided on one last foray into the darkness, this time equipped with something to help me find my way back. I tied a couple rolls of garden twine around a heavy piece of junk I placed back in my yard, and I unwound it as I went back in. I had one hand slowly unraveling the twine while the other held the flashlight. I had the stick under my arm for the time being. Going down again, a strange thought crossed into my head, one that whispered before, but feeling it the second time was too patent to notice. The slope had rhythmic bumps, interludes of rounded edges that were too perfectly aligned to be natural. Near smooth in the middle, but very apparent when looking at the concave sides. It was almost like they were once earthen stairs that had been worn down through use. I didn't want to dwell on that too much, knowing this hole wasn't here for my entire time living here, so to see something so used was too much to bear. The whistling of the wind outside faded the further I went in, mixing in with some faint chatter. Maybe some passerbys were just as confused as me about an open door on a lawn. And soon, I was at the crossroads I found before. I peeked left and right, but knew the left turn would lead under my house, the section I was most worried about. I toyed in my head for a while about just turning back, maybe calling a professional. Though, a professional what? I did not know. Someone else to take a look. But I mainly just wanted to make sure that my house would at least make it through the night. This decision was soon taken from me. The wind, that was only a whine before, gave a loud howl. It was a strong gust between the many small whispers it had been doing until then, but the gust must have lined up perfectly with the door. It slammed shut with an earthen thud rather than a wooden bang you'd expect from a door slam. The line was taut now, the twine held in place by the closed door, so I followed it back up to try get it loose and try again. Maybe next time propping the door open for security. But as I gave the door a push, it didn't budge. Silly me was pushing with the muscle memory strength used to open a regular door, but this was horizontal, so I realized I needed to add some heft to pry it open. So I tried again, with more gusto. Nothing. I furrowed at this, trying again, harder. Nothing. Worried, I perched the leg higher in the slope and shoved. Nothing. I crouched damn near into a ball, twisted the handle, and jumped with the door flush on my back. Nothing. It didn't even give a rattle, even on my strongest attempt. It was well and truly stuck now. I bashed repeatedly, hoping that the voices outside could hear me, but all that remained was silence. Pressing my ear against the door didn't even yield the whines of the wind outside. Eventually, the silence was broken, but not from the outside. It was subtle at first, but unmistakable. There was a scuttling sound in the dirt deeper into the tunnels. The banging seemed to have stirred something dwelling in the darkness. This left me with the ultimatum of my life. Stay and keep trying the door, knowing I was far into a dead end, or go further in to find an alternative exit, to at the very least have a chance to move away from whatever was waking in the tunnels. I gave a final, silent heave, putting my entire body into a hard squat, making sure the doorknob was turned, but to no avail. I was stuck with option B. I knew the twine I brought was finite, but I still opted to use it as much as possible. I made my way to the crossroads and made the left I originally settled on when I first went in. My hope was that if this was a system centered around my house, there might have been another exit in my house, though the thought of that was something I didn't want to dwell on too much in the moment. I carefully carried myself forward, trying to stay composed between more scuttling sounds or dirt sprinkling from the low ceiling. My senses were on edge, and they only got more heightened with each step deeper. I kept my light downward, like the headlights of a car. I didn't want the bloom to bleed too far forward in case something surprised me up ahead. I kept my presence as small as possible, minimal sounds, slow breathing, and slow steps. But a sound trickled into my ears, making my hair stand on end. Something so distinguished and recognizable that I couldn't logic it away as dirt or paranoia. A huff of a deep breath into the tunnel behind me. This was only exasperated when, on top of that, I felt the slightest tug on the twine. I must have stepped on a bit of slack in the darkness. The relief I felt from having looked into the correct direction was overwritten by the feeling that it was stalking me from behind. No matter how far I moved, it seemed to still be there, matching my pace as if watching me like prey. This was coupled with an intrusive thought that this was only making me move deeper and deeper into the tunnels, further away from the only exit I knew of. I was so preoccupied with this that my face made a soft thud with the wall in front of me. And this was the tipping point for whatever was following me. Like the pop of a starting gun at a race, whatever stalked now hunted. I heard its skitters rapidly pound the ground as it sprinted towards me. My fear of a dead end was short-lived as I saw it was another split. I dropped the twine and grabbed the stick from under my arm, knowing the twine wouldn't last a run, and I needed my arms free to run as fast as possible. Having turned left before, I chose to go right this time and sprinted away, hoping I was at least matching its pace to keep distance. With the light now pointed forward, I could see the next crossroad. I chose left and kept running, still hearing the scratching sprint behind me. Another turn, another crossroad, more turns. It wouldn't let up, and as I reached another fork, I heard a new set of scratching that started heading in my direction. Another one joined the fray. This forced my choice to the direction opposite to the sound. I ended up making so many turns and splits that I was well and truly lost. There was no way to backtrack my directional choices with how preoccupied I was. Turn after turn, randomly choosing whenever a choice presented itself, I reached another split. But this time, something was in front of me. With flickers of my flashlight swings from my sprint, I didn't get a good look at the thing. But what I did take in was sharp. Claws with concaves, like they were made for tunneling, but doubled as extremely dangerous weapons. I didn't have time to stop, so I lurched my arm into a swing and lashed out at the thing with my stick. It barely gave any resistance before shattering. Without a doubt, it did no damage, but it stunned it enough for me to slip by. I discarded what remained of the stick and headed away from the thing, knowing that the others were also catching up. I dipped around bends and turns as best as possible, but I knew my endurance was reaching its limit, and these things showed no signs of slowing down. This was their domain, and they held all the advantages here. As I ran, I caught glimpses of the walls. Occasionally, there were mars of marks in a symmetrical pattern, obscenely long gashes left by their tunneling claws. Some were set deep, more than lethal if they were to hit me, showing me the consequences of being caught. I took a turn fast, and my foot caught on something. I flopped face down into the dirt, my helmet saving me from a broken nose. If slowing down was a danger, this was a death sentence. I pulled my leg up to check the damage, trying to be conscious of every second spent, but as I looked down, I saw what I had tripped on. A body. It wasn't human. It was one of them. Its maw hung agape, life long since gone from its eyes. Signs of decay had set in all over. The thing that made me rule out death of natural causes were the puncture wounds littered all over the body. Whatever did it went deep, but some that must have ricocheted stuck out. Thin metal needles protruded from some of the wounds. I was distracted. I realized I'd been staring too long, enamored by the sight before me. At the pace that I heard them, they should have been on top of me any second. However, they weren't. I could still hear them, but they slowed, then stopped. There were a few confused putters before, as quickly as they came, I could hear them slowly scatter away. I didn't have time to ponder on what caused this, as I heard more steps coming towards me, but these were much heavier. Powerful thuds that I could almost feel while still on the floor. In the direction I was headed, I saw a new figure, larger, more humanoid, and slowly lumbering my way. Its eyes reflected a faint green, and it was holding something in both hands, but I couldn't see what. I tried to stand back up, but I couldn't. My leg twisted under me, and I could tell the heat I felt was my legs swelling. Even if I'd made it up, I did not know which direction to run. There was doom in either direction. I slumped back down, choosing to die on the comfort of the floor than the pain of running. And as the lumbering behemoth walked up to me, it stopped short. I looked back up, feeling that it was the last thing I would see, but was stunned, trying to process what was in front of me. Beneath all the metal and technology that stood there was a man. I could see parts of his lower face, and I recognized the gloved hand of a human. The top half of his face was covered with a helmet that seemed to have lenses where his eyes should have been, most likely a peripheral to let him see in the dark. He was decked out in something I'd only imagined from a sci-fi movie. I saw what he held in his hand, some sort of gun, though one I didn't recognize from my limited knowledge of current era weaponry. Looking at him, just stood there, not saying or doing anything. I think he was as stunned as I was. Eventually, it was him who broke the silence. "Who are you?" he muttered. His mind probably settled on it in the jumble of thoughts we were both in. I started to introduce myself, but I think the reality of the situation kicked in, so he interrupted me before I began and told me to follow him. So I did. And he only led me to more questions. Where he took me was a stark contrast to the dark hells I just came from. I was in a makeshift room carved into what looked like a scientific facility. People worked on intricate machines, chemicals and computers. A few men standing around were in the same exoskeleton suits as the man who brought me here. To avoid collapse, thick metal beams acted as pillars to the installed metal ceiling. The metal panels lined the walls, which looked structural as well. Each time someone glanced at me, they would do a double take, the second time wearing a shocked expression, followed by quickly getting back to whatever task they had on hand. I don't know who'd win if there was a competition for more questions. I sensed no hostility though, a step up from the horrors I'd been pulled from. Soon I was brought to another man wearing another exosuit, but marred with more damage and a collection of symbols which I could only assume marked his higher rank. "Hey Captain, I got a weird one. Found this guy on patrol." He looked at me inquisitively, a pause hanging in the air, before he plainly demanded, "Speak. Tell me everything." A simple request. I had no reason to hold anything back, so I caught him up with everything that had happened. He was bemused that this started with me just trying to sort out a fickle HOA situation, but he had no reason to doubt anything I said. After more thought, he finally uttered a call. "Take him to the room." "Wait, what's going on? How do I get back?" This is all I managed to mutter as my arm was grabbed and pulled away. I blurted out more questions, but they were ignored. I tried asking my now prison guard, but he stayed silent under the watchful eye of the captain. When he let go, I was in a room with a few others. This crowd did not look like they stumbled in here like I had. They were dressed like some of the people working the equipment in the main room. "Stay here, we'll figure out what to do," he said in an assuring tone, though there was only so much assurance I could have in this situation. He closed the door, and I heard it latch shut. In a futile attempt, I tested it, and it was indeed locked. Questions still swirling around my head, it wasn't long before I was the one to broach conversation. "What is going on? What is this place?" A pause of silence followed as they gathered their thoughts, but one of them spoke up, giving me their best attempt at enlightenment. "So, you really don't know what this place is? You weren't sent here from the higher-ups?" one man said. Before I could answer, another captive deduced the answer. "Look at him, he's not in uniform, he's just some guy. This doesn't make sense." I started to get frustrated. I was in some place beyond imagination with horrors above my comprehension, yet I was treated as the anomaly here. So I snapped at them. "Look, I just stumbled in here. I have no idea what's going on. I've been lost, got chased, nearly damn well killed. Just tell me something. Anything. I don't know what to do." I trailed off at the end, my outburst quickly losing gusto, knowing that they were as captive as me. Another pause before the first man spoke up. "My name is Dr. Jameson, and you've somehow wandered into base ivory of the..." He was cut off by a hushed "too much" before he continued. "Look, you've somehow stumbled into an experiment. We found a way here through a door, a sort of dimensional anomaly. We scientists were stationed here to make grand discoveries. You've seen our personal guard, the men in the tech fits. They were assigned to protect us while we carved out an outpost to work in. However..." As he took a moment, the others' faces dropped, the signal of bad news. "Our door just stopped working, or at least somehow jammed shut. We don't know if it was intentional from the higher-ups. They've been known to experiment on the experimenters, but since this happened, we've not been allowed to work on an exit strategy. The tech-fit mercs have us working on our experiments, regardless of circumstance, following the commands of those who sent us here, and they refuse to deviate despite the circumstance. This room is where they put people who try to do otherwise." At this, more silence fell, but I had a lingering thought itching in the back of my brain. So, what does this mean for me? He just looked back at me one more time and said, "I don't know." This ended the conversation, as we all had things to think about. Eventually, a call was made from outside that it was time to sleep, so we settled into the bunks. I awoke to some yelling and what sounded like the pinging of metal. At this, I bolted up and looked around. It seemed I was the only one perturbed by this, but my motion seemed to have stirred Dr. Jameson awake. "What's going on?" I asked. Probably the moles. One must have gotten close. The moles? I asked back. Yeah, you said you were chased, so I'm guessing you saw them, or at the very least heard them. Blind, mammalian, tunnelers. We discovered them after losing contact from the higher-ups, so we were never given a name for them, so we just called them moles. In my head, I scoffed at the mundane name, but chose not to let it out to keep conversation flowing. So, what are they? We don't know. It's one of our tasks down here. Examine local species. He spoke of this like a job, rather than a fight for survival. But his casual nature did give some slight assurance. Having ran out of questions, he took my silence as the end and rolled back over to sleep. Knowing there was nothing more to do, I did the same. When I woke next, there was a metallic bang. The door rattled from the other side, and an authoritative voice yelled for us to wake up. With the lack of urgency the others had, I assumed this was just a routine wake-up call. We stretched the sleep away and opened the door. A guard stood there and glanced at the room and stepped aside. I furrowed my brow in surprise, thinking that if we were to escape, he had left more than an opening. But I was even more surprised when I saw the others meander out of their own accord. What's going on? Are we being let go? I asked Dr. Jameson as he walked by. It's breakfast. We're being let out to eat, he replied. I lowered my voice to a hush. But this is the perfect time to escape, no? It's just one guy. I glanced over to him. He doesn't even have a weapon. This gave Dr. Jameson a chuckle. And go where? We're safer here than out there, and they know this. At this, he joined the line filing out, and I followed in suit. We ended up in a sort of makeshift mess room. Tables and basic kitchen appliances. Stacked high were large boxes, and each person in turn put their hand in and pulled out a random metallic bag. Damn curry, I hate this one muttered, and he took it over to a kettle and started preparing it. Everyone pulled something out, and I was last, reaching in to find a bag labelled lamb. I looked at it, confused, and Dr. Jameson peeked at what I had. Wow, lucky. That's the best one. I'll trade you, he muttered. Do you not get to choose what you get? I asked back. I mean, yeah, you could, but the randomness of what you eat is damn near the only entertainment you can get down here. I'm pretty sure hitting the lamb jackpot is what kept some people sane down here. I looked down at my bag of food, knowing he probably needed this more than me, so I agreed to the trade without seeing what he had. His bag was labelled cowboy casserole. I followed the instructions in the bag and prepared it as best as possible. It wasn't a spectacular taste, but it wasn't bad either. These were probably standard issue MREs they'd brought with them when they set this place up. Damn near unperishable food for long expeditions. When Dr. Jameson opened his lamb bag, I expected a divine aroma compared to what I was putting up with. But no, it was just as mundane as mine. I think they must have created a placebo of a lamb hype. Maybe someone initially started the rumor, knowing it would add some excitement to someone's day and have others looking forward to something. Thinking that it was a pragmatic ideal, I kept my thoughts to myself and ate as much as possible. When we were done, we were lined up. The soldier walked back and forth a few times, glaring at us occasionally, before speaking up. As you know, delinquency and insubordination is not tolerated. You have been designated to the room indefinitely for your actions. However, this is your daily chance to come out. Return to work and do not cause trouble for the others with your plans. Silence fell, and a few dropped their heads in defeat and stepped out the room. After a while longer, he spoke once more in a defeated tone. "Okay then, everyone else, follow me back to the room." The remaining people shuffled back, myself included. Knowing I'd be stuck back in that room for a while, I paid more attention to my surroundings, trying to get as much information as possible. I noticed much more now that adrenaline wasn't altering my focus. I saw things they were working on, sampling the dirt, picking apart the bodies of the moles, and tinkering with pieces of the armor the guards wear and other technologies. I got some glances back, presumably from people who hadn't seen me the first time around. But one scientist in particular had a startling gaze. He looked like something in his head clicked into place, maybe an epiphany on something he was working on. Yet his expression never shifted back to his work. It was solely focused on me. When we returned to the room, we were simply told to await further instruction. The conversation in the room was dry. Either they were socially inept or purposefully closed me out, and I couldn't figure out which. The closest to answers I had was Dr. Jameson, but the way he was cut off showed they didn't trust me with the information. If I could get him alone, I was sure I could get him to spill more details, but it was impossible with this room situation. Suddenly, there was a scuffling sound from outside, and people were shouting. I couldn't distinguish what was said through the thick door, but it sounded heated. The door banged, then quickly opened, the scientist that was pressed up against it falling in. His face scrunched up in anger, and expletives were thrown at the guard who ignored him as he locked the door. However, the second the door clicked, his facade dropped, his expression lightened up, and he set to a sly grin. When I got a good look at him, I recognized him as the man glaring at me when I walked back to the room. "Hi," he opened with. However, it wasn't a universal greeting to the people in the room. It was directed solely at me. "Oh, hi?" I mused back. Not deterred by my hesitation, he went on, a lot more open than the people I'd been stuck with so far. "My name is Dr. Kirkland. You're obviously not from around here. So, how did you get here?" he asked. I went on to explain my situation, though I wasn't happy with the lack of reciprocation each time I did this. His face displayed his feelings on each bit of information he extracted from my tale, not hiding his thoughts on my predicament. After some deliberation, he broke his silence. "Look, I want to get out of here, need to get out of here, and I want your help." I just wore a shocked expression at this. He continued, gesturing to the people around him to listen in, who were now leaning in to pay attention. "We're safe here. We have use. You don't." He pointed at me. "Your safety is not guaranteed." He almost sounded like a salesman, giving his best pitch to sell his idea, but I also couldn't refute his logic, especially with how little I knew. Before I could even respond, the roused crowd started to pipe in. "Sure, we have use, but to compromise the facility with escape is grounds for termination. They would not let that fly," one chimed in. Hums of agreement resounded from the audience. "Even if we did get out, where would we go? These aren't some pushovers like the FBI or CIA," another person interjected. I was surprised that he spoke so lightly of what I was led to believe were the best. This must be deeper than I could possibly imagine. This is a room full of the smartest people in this dimension. They call the shots, but we're the brains behind everything. You don't think we could manage something easy like this? I know for a fact some of you have achieved feats that make this look like child's play. At this, He shot some specific glances to certain people, which they looked back with growing confidence, which again, I had no context to what he was talking about. Remember, we don't just work here. We made this place. He didn't think I would think ahead. At this, Dr. Kirkland pulled out a pale blue device with a mismatched asymmetrical pattern on the end, almost like the teeth of a skeleton key. If his speech hadn't fully convinced everyone, this revelation certainly did. In turn, everyone who thought themselves of use chipped in with info or services they could provide. I know the code for the equipment room. There's a set rotation the guards follow. I made the schedule. The north side tunnel is the least guarded. We'll have our best shot there. Excitement grew in the room, and I started falling for it. It seemed individually, no one had any luck towards escape, but together, they were the jigsaw pieces that fell perfectly into place. Once the plan was set, all we had to do was wait for the perfect time. One man had his ear to the door, the room silent for him to make the call for action. Dr. Kirkland stood by with his strange key, ready to move on the signal. After many agonizing moments, the man up front raised his hand and everyone snapped into place. Though these people were only the scientists, I could tell they had some form of military training. No words were uttered, only silent hand motions directed the squad on how to move. Even the way they walked minimized sound a lot. Compared to them, I sounded like a lumbering giant, even though I was trying my best to mimic their posture. We slipped around corners, the front man moving with confidence, knowing we were moving through blind spots. We reached the turn, and he double-checked if it was clear. He made a motion with his hand, and another man turned the corner. When I moved round to follow the rest of them, he quickly entered a combination on a number pad and opened a thick metal door. Inside was something that looked like something from the future. Equipment that I hadn't the faintest idea did what. But it seemed I didn't need to, because each scientist went straight for what they needed. Some grabbed goggles that had a green hue on the lens. Two grabbed the large rifles I saw the guards carrying, and others grabbed things I hadn't seen before. Since I was apparently not given a crash course on how this tech worked, I was simply left with my bike helmet and flashlight, much to the degrading looks from the others. If bets were placed on who would die first, all of them would have bet on me. We left the room as silently as possible. In a single file, I followed the point lead around more turns. We passed by rooms that looked like they were used for storage or an office, but other rooms were so beyond what I understood that I had no idea what they did in them. As we reached the straight tunnel that transitioned from metal to dirt, a sure sign of an exit, we heard yells from behind. I couldn't fully understand what they said, but I picked up on the distinct word, escaped. They knew we were gone and would soon be behind us. And now, the chase was on. We stopped just shy of the darkness, some adjusting their goggles to see in the dark, others pulling out strange-looking devices that lit up the tunnel in front of them. Dr. Kirkland turned to me, an adrenaline-fueled grin beaming at me. "Okay, where is the entrance you came in from?" he asked. "What? Oh, I don't know. I was lost when they found me," I replied. His face dropped. "Wait, did you hinge this entire plan on that?" Dr. Jameson blurted. A look of confidence reappeared on Dr. Kirkland's face, though this one looked more forced. "Don't worry, if he got in, it means we can get out," he roused. We all made our way deeper, footsteps picking up behind us. I didn't have the heart to tell him that my door jammed, just like theirs. It wasn't long until all hell broke loose. I was held up in a dark cubby with Dr. Kirkland, running so fast that some of us got split up on the first fork and the scuttling forced more of us to separate. The ones carrying the rifles were needed at the front, but lagged behind due to the weight. And when I saw one fire, it sent the scientist near horizontal from the kickback after only a few shots. What shots landed on the mole well and truly killed it, but the loss of control sent a few shots into innocent bystanders. The wounds left behind were near perfect holes straight through, the wall behind having the remnants of metal spikes. A caseless railgun shot that could be used for long excursions, I was told during some downtime. I'd lost track of Dr. Jameson, but the footsteps, followed by shots and screams, told me that the guard's leniency had been spent. It was either stay and work or die, and we had all chosen the latter. Dr. Kirkland and myself were holed up in a cubby, just big enough to fit us, a blind spot if someone ran past. We stayed quiet when we heard a scuttling and felt a breeze of moles rushing towards the commotion. "I have to get out, I have to get out, I have to get out," Dr. Kirkland kept muttering to himself. Despite the chaos and all the lives lost, he was driven to get out. Him not saying us or we had me rethinking his pragmatic coaxing of the group. Were we just fodder to help him escape? There were noises still, but far off, so I had to find out. "Talk to me. You had a plan to get here. What do we do now?" I whispered. This seemed to break him out of his stupor, and he sat there for a while in silence, thinking. "I need to get out. We need to get out. Wait until they've passed and we move forward." It was such a vague plan, no thought beyond what I could have come up with myself. What sickened me was the lack of initiative to help the others. We just sat there, hearing their cries for help. They were secondary to his own escape, myself included most likely. So I pried on what I was more curious about in that moment. "Why do you need to get out so badly?" I asked bluntly. At this, he took another pause, contemplating a response. "I have a family. I miss them. We were sent here on the promise of returning. We were to set up the facility, then cycling scientists to work here. I was one of the first in. I need to get out. I need to see them." He was fixated on this. He must have thought this humanized his actions, but the screaming and dying in the distance made it all the more selfish. Who knew how many families were losing someone here, just for him to try see his? All I knew was that he grabbed one of those insanely put together weapons, so sticking with him was still my best shot. The screaming and fighting were dying down. We quieted down ourselves as our surroundings did, and as we did, heavy and deliberate footsteps approached. No doubt one of the guards. They were creeping with caution, on the lookout for hiding scientists and violent moles. A barely audible whisper trickled into my ear. "If he sees us, point your flashlight in his eyes. I will do the rest." My mind boggled with responses. Was he planning on us taking the guard down together, or using me as bait? I no longer had faith in his motives. However, the footsteps were drawing nearer, and each step taken was taking away time to reply. I hadn't decided on what to do, so I let myself move in the moment. The steps clunked to a stop before us, and a pause lingered in the air. The crackle of static rang out, and he spoke into his radio. "I've got one here, ready to engage." Click. We were compromised, so now was the time to strike. I heard Dr. Kirkland yell out, and out of reflex, I flicked my light on and swung it around, looking to get it in his visor. But as soon as I found his head, we both stopped. He wasn't looking at us, but was looking further down the hallway. However, our outburst made him turn to face us, to which he flinched from being blinded by my light. I guess Dr. Kirkland was right. Whatever they used to see in the dark seemed to flashbang his vision with a direct light source. A screech followed straight after, but it wasn't from the guard. It wasn't even human. A sprinting thud crashed from where he was looking at, and as I turned, a mole dove straight at us. Dr. Kirkland fired a few stray shots, and one pierced straight into his abdomen. But like before, the shots also sent Dr. Kirkland falling back, and this left him no time to get out of the way. With the mole's momentum, it landed claws first into both Dr. Kirkland and the guard, who never stood a chance while blinded. The guard fell from his hit, and the mole dug its nails wildly at both of them, goring them into a mess. Each swipe slowed down until it stopped, still perched between them, and slunk onto the floor. Turning my light towards it more, I saw it had bled out from the wound Dr. Kirkland had inflicted, and silence remained. I froze, now flying solo. If Dr. Kirkland had a hollow plan that he was loosely following, I was now left entirely alone, a ship in open water with no wind. The guard's radio crackled, a deep voice repeatedly asking for an update, but who knows if they knew the exact turns he made to find him, or what was left of him at least. However, one tiny piece of information was the basis for my steps forward. The direction we heard the guard come from was my right, which told me that was the direction of the facility. So I turned left and started walking. I opted not to take the weapon. I had seen it get someone killed more than it saved. The tunnels rewarded agility over brute force, but this didn't ease my mind on the challenges that faced me. Time passing was mental agony. I'd been wandering the tunnels for what must have been hours, sometimes running from the skittering chase of a mole, other times lurking in cutaway channels from the guards. Through the distant chatter I would occasionally hear on their radios, they were looking for only 1 or 2 more scientists, but it was still kill on sight. If they would so easily dispose of people 1,000,000 times more useful than me, I would be squashed like an ant on sight. They wouldn't even think twice. The distance I'd create from the guards did not provide safety. Each step away from them was also a step away from the safety that they used to provide. I was past the protection of their capture, however long that would have lasted. Gunfire broke me out of my thoughts. Nearby, war cries rang out, and footsteps of all types were bouncing around. The lighter skitters, though, were headed towards me, scared off in my direction. I turned on my light, knowing that stealth was no longer an option, and ran away from the noises as fast as I could with my still swollen ankle. The gunfire rang out every so often, screeches of beasts and men intertwined. It was an even fight. Skirmishes that happened sporadically between the mole's retreats and attacks. Hit and run tactics. Each battle created more distance between them and me, but they would catch up between fights. Whether intentional or not, each turn I made, they would follow. It was impossible for me to tell if the moles thought my footsteps was one of theirs, backup leading the guards into a trap, or if they knew the guards were hunting me, setting up a distraction for them to ambush. I dodged around turns, making each choice as randomly as possible, but all the parties were still on my tail. Another skirmish broke out, and it only sounded a few turns away. I was too slow with my hobbling run. It wasn't long until they were on the same corridor as me, so I looked for somewhere to hide, hoping they'd pass by. Fear came over me, knowing this plan had its flaws. Images lingered in my head that they'd find me curled up, or that I was caught in some sort of crossfire. My light lit up a turn that deviated from the tunnel I was in, but the dirt sloped. Something inset caught my light. Colour, standing out from the dull brown and grey of the ground, thin and linear. It was my twine. I had somehow made my way back. I rushed up the slope, my legs burning from my monumental journey so far. As soon as I reached the top, I grabbed the handle and paused with a silent prayer. With a make-or-break war cry, I twisted and shouldered the door as hard as I could, expecting resistance. Instead, it flung open with ease, sending me reeling out. I rolled on the ground from the momentum and quickly scrambled to my feet. I slammed the door shut, silencing the battle beneath, and grabbed the heaviest thing nearby, dragging it on top. I had to catch my breath, lost from both exhaustion and adrenaline. I slumped onto my back, the weight of everything keeping me grounded. I was still for the first time in so long, and I was relishing it. The sun was dull, which I estimated to be the late afternoon to early evening. Turning my head gently, I saw where I was. Scrapped cars and discarded belongings scattered around, a crane in the distance that was used to haul mess around into a nearby compactor. It was a dump. My peace was short-lived. I felt a multitude of shakes, but not from the door. My phone buzzed repeatedly in my pocket. I had almost forgotten about it since losing signal while stuck down there. The battery had the slimmest of red lines left. Still, there was enough to see the notifications now rolling in, the signal returning, opening the floodgates of everything I'd missed. Messages and missed calls from work rolled in, ranging from asking to where I was, to anger about skipping a shift, to concern about my whereabouts. Their concern warmed me a little. I had messages blasted from family asking where I was, a range of jokes at first about overdoing it on a late night out, to genuine fear of my well-being. And finally, a single email. It was from the HOA, telling me that I had not removed the mess in time, so they hired some contractors to clear it up. The bill of which would be added to my fine. I was once in a terrible accident. I was on my way home from work, but the elevators were out of service. I had to take 6 flights of stairs after a 12-hour shift. I wasn't paying attention. I had a terrible fall, and when I opened my eyes, I couldn't move. I could barely breathe, and I could see my hand twitch in the corner of my eye. It took me a moment to realize that hand wasn't mine. I couldn't feel my fingers. In a couple of seconds, I'd gone from on my way home to barely alive. I watched my breath condense against the stone tiles. I could feel anything but a dull pain radiating down my spine. The more I thought about it, the more my pulse hammered, and the more lightheaded I felt. I was bleeding, but I couldn't see or feel from where. I couldn't call out for help. It was as if one of my lungs was lagging. I didn't know where one breath started and another ended. Luckily, my co-worker, Andrew, was working late. He found me and stayed with me until the EMTs arrived. From that point on, I barely remember anything. Apparently, I was alone on that floor for about 20 minutes. I was lucky to be alive. It wasn't a full-on broken neck, but a severe fracture. I had to go through countless surgeries. Thank God it happened on company property and that I was fully insured. Not only did I get the best possible treatment money could pay for, but they also authorized any additional payments for pretty much whatever my doctor would recommend. But despite that, I was a wreck. Looking back at the time, I was barely alive. I was just waiting for life to come back, but it never did. I improved, but they could tell early on that I was suffering from nerve root damage. It left me partially paralyzed in my right leg. There were a couple of other issues that would flare up from time to time, but nothing life-threatening. Just little things, like a random pain in my ring finger or hearing a snapping noise when I yawned. But coming to the realization that I wasn't going to make a full recovery was devastating. It felt like my best days were behind me, and every reassuring word was like a sarcastic jab. Over time, I got back on my feet. I went from a wheelchair to crutches to a cane over the course of 1.5 years. But no matter what I used, the pain was always there. That dull, thrumming pain radiating throughout my body. And every now and then, I get a shortness of breath when standing up, bringing me right back to that memory of my face pressing against that door, watching my shallow breaths condense on the stone tiles. While I tried to get back to work and resign myself to a new normality, there was always that nagging feeling in the back of my mind that I was living a lesser life. So while I kept up appearances, I was resenting what I'd become. So during lunch breaks and countless late nights, I found myself wading through medical articles, expert opinions, and journals detailing experimental treatments. Nothing was decisive. There were no secret tricks. It didn't matter if I had $100 to spend or 100 million. There simply was no way to magically get better. So I looked further. Alternative medicine, obscure YouTube videos, everything from nutritional supplements to faith healing. But it was all noise. Nothing was pointing me to a solution. After months of obsessive searching and consultation, all I got was recommendations for pain medication. There was nothing else. Then came a late September night, which set me on a new path. I was browsing the blog of a woman who'd gone through a similar experience as me, and she was documenting many struggles she faced along the way. I spent a couple of hours reading her thoughts and watching a couple of shorts when I noticed something in one of the comment sections. There were rarely any comments at all, but this one stood out. It just said, Esprone. That could mean 1,000 things, but to me, it sounded like medication. I'd heard them all at that point. I had a whiteboard with the top 250 list of various quack solutions I'd heard, and this one wasn't on there. While I was skeptical, it was still another lead. There were no responses referencing this, there were no video replies, and the account had no other comments. All I had to go off was Esprone and the nickname of the poster, Lluvia. It's Spanish for rain. I figured it might be a kind of supplement or off-the-books medication, so I followed the trail. I searched for all kinds of combinations of rain, broken neck, Esprone, and a bunch of other topics. It took me days, but one combination of words sent me down a rabbit hole that pointed me at a lead. It was one of those sites where you could secretly rate your workplace. A couple of disgruntled workers had rated an employer of theirs particularly low. There were no mentions of Esprone, but I think the algorithm latched onto it for some reason. They wrote as such. My supervisor has been an absolute cow since her accident. Constant unpaid overtime, threats and accusations. She's taking it out on everyone. I don't care if she's in a wheelchair. She's single-handedly tanking this department. Then, on the bottom of the review, an addendum added about 2 months after the initial posting. Edit. Out of the wheelchair and still a cow. Don't work here. It didn't take me long to look that company up, and a name immediately popped out. Rain Calloway. It was a long shot, but it sounded like this person had overcome a grievous injury. Maybe there was something there. She worked at an investment company with a local office. I could drop by at lunch and hope for the best. I went to see Rain the next day. While the lead was tenuous at best, I felt like I had to try. When I got there, I saw a couple of people leaving the building, all dressed in fancy black and white clothing with monocolored ties. There were a handful of women among them, one of which was given a bit of a wide berth. She was in her early 50s and was the only one with a large scarf. Going for a Hail Mary, I approached her. "Excuse me," I said. "Are you Rain?" She looked up at me. She had dark blue eyes, the same colour as a sunflower brooch on a scarf. She raised an eyebrow, slowing down. "What of it?" she asked. "I have a question about a comment you made." She rolled her eyes and turned her back on me. "It said something like, Esperone?" I continued. "I don't know what it means, but I get the feeling you could help me." She froze. Her colleagues waited for her, but she waved them off. She approached me, looking me up and down with a stiff neck. "How bad is it?" she asked. "Pretty bad. Bad enough to get in trouble for it? If I can get rid of it, yeah." "You can," she nodded. "Yeah, you can get rid of it." She invited me out to lunch, asking me a couple of personal questions. I told her about my accident and the lingering issues I had. She, in turn, talked about getting hit by a car. She had been paralysed from the waist down for 2 years, but obviously, she wasn't paralysed anymore. I looked up from my salad. Rain had this intense stare, like she was weighing my soul. "So, what's the secret?" I asked. "There's a guy," she explained, "but it's gonna cost you." "I got some money put away," I sighed. "Just give me the number." "Not that kind of cost," she said, shaking her head, "but we can figure it out." We exchanged contact information. As I left, the pain in my leg was worse than ever. The prospect of getting rid of that pain kind of emphasized it. You can't stop poking at it once you know it's there. At night, as I went to bed, I got a text message. A time and a place, no details. Looking it up online, it seemed to be a hotel, but I got no room number, no directions, nothing. The next day, I went straight from work to that hotel. I dressed up in a business casual blazer and hoped they wouldn't stare too long at the cane. Then again, if these people worked with those who'd been in accidents, chances were they wouldn't even notice the cane. But why the secrecy? I got to the hotel at about 6 p.m. A pretty fancy place, at least 4 stars. There was a small fountain in the lobby with black marble floor. It smelled of flowers and chemicals. As soon as I entered the lobby, there was a man by the elevators waving me over. "This way, sir." He pressed the button for the 12th floor for me, but didn't say anything. It was as if I was supposed to know what to do already. I stepped into the back of the elevator, trying my best to stay calm. 100 thoughts ran through my head as music played. I had no idea what to expect, but I sure as hell didn't expect what I got. the doors opened to a scene straight out of a movie. Wide open double doors, guarded by burly men with visible gun holsters. I could smell cigar smoke all the way out in the hallway. There was music playing from one of the rooms further in as these gorgeous, marble-sculpted people wandered back and forth, serving hors d'oeuvres from silver platters. I got a lot of curious eyes on me, but they calmed as soon as they noticed the cane. Stepping forward, one of the doormen stopped me. I thought he was going to check my identification or ask me to leave, but instead, his features softened. "You need any help, sir?" No, I'm good," I said. "Thanks." "Enjoy your stay." There were about 25 guests in total, catered to by a staff of about a dozen. It was hard to get a good read on the other attendants, both because of the dim lighting and cigar smoke, but also because a lot of them seemed busy. Some were stuck looking through their phones, while the others were having intimate conversations with one another and the servants. "You lost there, boyo." I turned around to see a man that can only be described as a living scarecrow. At least 6'7", pale, with white hair combed back and gelled, intense blue eyes hidden behind a pair of sunglasses. "I think you're looking for the man in the inner sanctum," he continued. "Just follow the crutches." "The crutches? Can't miss 'em." And with that, he left. Just like he said, there were crutches covering the western wall. Some short, some long, some old. There was a wooden one that looked like it was about to fall apart. There were a couple of display cases lining the wall, showing off various strange items. The first one that caught my eye was half a human skull dipped in silver. There was a plaque next to it. "The Society of Broken Necks." That was it. Esperone. It was a shortened code for whatever this group was, and the half skull was an icon. But what the hell had I gotten myself into? Was it a cult? I was browsing the many strange items displayed, trying to figure out what kind of people I was dealing with. For example, there was a film reel for something called The End of Eternity, with a framed certificate of authenticity from director Roy Hampton. I was reading through the fine print when someone tapped my shoulder. Rain. "He got a copy from the congregation at the 12th Sky Assembly," she said. "Insane people, but they got all kinds of stuff." "Is that any good?" "I haven't seen it," she smiled. "I don't think you're meant to." "Then why have it?" "Because others don't." It was time to meet the man of the hour. I never got to know his full or real name, but they called him Garland. First time I saw him, he was sitting in what I can only describe as a leather throne. He kept his hands in 2 bowls of magenta-coloured sludge, like a porridge. It smelled of chlorine and artificial flowers. Garland was the kind of person where you can tell how old they are. He had the face and hair of a teenager, but the grey in his beard stubble suggested he was older than he appeared. I couldn't get a good look at him though. I could barely see anything through the dark and the smoke. Rain went ahead, clearing the way for me. Approaching him, she turned to introduce me. "I brought you a special friend," she said, pointing at me. "I can see that," Garland smiled. "Nice cane." He leaned back in his seat, keeping his hands soaked. He was very deliberate with his movements, like he explored every single muscle. Without breaking eye contact, he nodded at me. "I can help you with that." The rest of that night, I was one of the in crowd. I literally just had to hold out a hand to get a drink. Turns out, Garland co-owned the place. He was a silent partner to a variety of hotels, motels, hostels, and event planning services. They were currently working with a partner up north, aiming to acquire some cheap new locations in Alaska and northern Canada. I didn't like the way he said it though. It kind of sounded like there was someone doing something they shouldn't. At some point, in the middle of the night, I had to sit down with Rain. She was a bit tipsy, so she took the time to explain her relation to Garland. "I was paralyzed," she said. "Waist down, completely paralyzed. And it got better." "Better?" she laughed. "Better than I've ever been. One session with Garland, and that's that." "One session? One session." She smiled as we clinked our glasses. "I could do one session. I'd pay a lot for that." I stayed there until early morning, just about an hour before the break of dawn. As I stumbled out, one of the doormen called me a cab and put a card in my wallet. A time and a place. I could barely wait. While I didn't trust this man, the results spoke for themselves. The thought of going back to normal ached me even worse than the dull pain in my leg. The day before the meeting, I was proofreading an addendum to a contract. I'd been working on that thing all day, and I wasn't even trying to seem interested. It was boilerplate stuff, and I considered just approving it as is without any clarification. I could barely pay attention anyway. Still, I soldiered on. I was on the last page when I got an email from a throwaway account. The initial line read, "Our dearest broken neck friend." It was Garland and his people contacting me ahead of my scheduled appointment. Instead of payment for his services, he asked for some information. It wasn't anything big, just a copy of the document I was working on. How he knew what I did for a living was disconcerting at best. There was no way. While it wasn't important in the big scale of things, it was technically a company secret. Still, I couldn't think of a way sharing that document would be inherently bad. It really was just a technicality. I wasn't thinking of anything but myself, I guess. I wanted to feel normal, and having that within my grasp was too enticing. I'd gone too far and seen what kind of people they were. Say what you will about Garland and his lifestyle, there was something more to it, something mystical. I sent the document and covered my tracks. Looking back at it, it was dumb, I know. I'm sure you've done your fair share of stupid things behind closed doors as well. I went to see Garland at the hotel the next day. There was a small room hidden away in the spa, behind an unmarked door. It was easy enough to spot. Rain was waiting for me. "You ready?" she asked, not looking up from the floor. "Yeah," I said. "What are you doing here?" "I'm your sponsor," she explained. "I'm responsible." She nodded at me and tapped on the door. It swung open. It was a plain white room with a single comfortable chair. It had the same chlorine smell that I'd noticed the last time I met Garland, the stuff he rubbed on his hands. Rain motioned at me to sit down, so I did. I think I must have dozed off. At some point, Garland was just there. I hadn't heard him enter the room, and he hadn't been there when I first arrived. And yet, there he was. Rain welcomed him. Seconds later, a cold pair of hands brushed away my hair, and another gently covered my eyes. "Try to relax," Garland said. "This won't take a minute." And it really didn't. It's hard to explain the sensation. It felt like sinking into a warm bath after a long day, like I'd had a full night's sleep after a big dinner. My joints relaxed and all the pain just melted away. As the pain in my leg evaporated, I almost cried. There was a tap on my shoulder, and when I opened my eyes, it was just me. And I felt fine. The next few days were amazing. I could literally dance all the way to work if I wanted to. I slept better, food tasted better, my hair felt thicker, and my skin got a bit of a sheen. Everything was just better. The only thing I noticed was that the muscle in my leg was still a bit off. It was as if the damage was still there, but hidden away. I was so thankful. I would have done anything if Garland came asking, and it didn't take too long before he did. Another email dropped, this time asking for a whole slew of documents on our next project. Secret stuff, the kind you can go to jail for talking about. And while I was thankful, I had no intention of incriminating myself. Garland didn't like that. Not one bit. I got one last message from an automated email address. "I can take it all away," it read. "You got 10 minutes. I didn't know what to believe, but given how suddenly I'd gotten rid of that pain, it wouldn't surprise me if it was just as simple to return it. At that point, I still thought it was some kind of alternative medicine kind of deal. Maybe that was the scam, having to go back for refills. Either way, I wasn't about to let it all go to waste. It was just words on paper. It couldn't hurt me. Besides, there were plenty of people at that party who'd probably colluded with Garland for a long time, and they seemed fine. So I justified it, over and over, trying to make it seem like a good idea. So yeah, I sent him whatever he wanted. Seconds later, I got invited back to the hotel. And that's sort of how it went for some time. Garland would check on me, and I'd send him copies. He'd invite me over to the hotel for pretty much whatever I wanted. And yeah, I knew it was bad, but I felt amazing. It was impossible to feel bad about my choices when everything in my body was screaming at me that this was the right thing to do. I got to sit in on all kinds of meetings between Garland and some of the other broken necks. They were talking about renting out a hotel for something they called the Blue Hill Tribe meeting. It sounded like an event just like any other, but something about the way they talked about it made it sound shady as hell. There was always someone strange at the door, people wanting to hire a stepminder, a guy who collected rare organs, a group of people who talked about getting backroom access to a hotel. I'm not sure why, but it sounded like they were sneaking into rooms. These were shady people, and I was okay with it. It was like a drug. I couldn't stop myself. It felt like my body was in better condition than it had ever been. And yet, I'd slip up every now and then. My leg wasn't really okay. It just kind of felt like it was. I'd seen this in the other people too. Rain, for example. As soon as she took a scarf off, her head would bob back and forth like her muscles weren't supporting her. Other people in the society had a variety of issues, but Garland had helped them forget it. One guy had an inverted knee like an ostrich. There was a woman who had an arm she could just twist and turn any way she wanted. Hell, even the doorman seemed to have issues. I think they had actually broken necks. The thought hit me that some of these people might actually die if it wasn't for Garland and his treatment. Maybe they really didn't have a choice but to serve. I couldn't help but to notice some cracks in the veneer. It started with Rain. She was having trouble giving Garland something he demanded once, and he wasn't happy about it. He invited me over to the side of his throne in the middle of a society gathering and raised his hand out of the bowl. Pointing at Rain, his hand seemed to mummify. Seconds later, Rain's head swung back and forth like a bobblehead, as whatever strength she'd had in her neck waned. She begged and pleaded, and then collapsed to the floor. She swore she'd get it done, whatever he wanted. Rain lay on the floor like a broken doll, barely able to move her eyes and arms. She had trouble breathing. I wanted to go up and help, but I couldn't. The entire room was acting like nothing was happening. When Garland was satisfied with her promises, he raised his other hand at her. His hand mummified, and Rain's legs started moving again. I offered her help, but she got up on her own. As she stormed off, Garland waved me over. "You keep doing what you do," he smiled, "and that won't be you." This was the status quo for months. At least once a week, I'd go see Garland. He got me a new car, he paid for an apartment, and whenever I'd ran into a problem, he'd fix it. Be it economical, physical, whatever. He had a guy for everything. Stocks and investments, he had a sure thing. Private jet to Italy, on the ground in 6 hours flat, no questions asked. But I saw some nasty stuff. People losing control of their bodies, falling to the floor screaming. Entire groups of people begging at Garland's feet. He'd hand out gifts and punishments like it was nothing, seemingly at random. But to me, I was doing okay. There'd be no repercussions. I was fine. But that changed. My company was running into issues where competing firms were beating us to new contracts. We were facing contract breaches and a loss of revenue. Our stock prices were tanking, and someone was buying out minor share investors. All of a sudden, we were getting uncomfortable questions. People being called in for meetings. IT was checking our emails. Sure, I'd covered my tracks, but I was getting nervous. And in the middle of all this, Garland wanted more. He didn't care if I got caught or not. He wanted his, and nothing I said would get in the way. But I literally couldn't get his documents anymore. It was a red alert. I was sweating bullets. I sent back a message telling him I couldn't get it. I got the same standard message as always. "I can take it all away. You got 10 minutes. I tried to explain. I couldn't get to it. I checked if I could log into an alternate account and access the folders anonymously, but there was no way. Passwords were changed. There were new logs procedures to record our activity. It was over. I couldn't do it. I just stared at my phone as 10 minutes passed. But there was no message. Nothing. I looked at my leg, expecting it to ache. Would the pain I hadn't felt for so long come back? What was going to happen to me? I figured I had two choices. I could try get to Garland's and plead my case, or hurry back home and try to cover my tracks. I was out in the parking lot in about 2 minutes. Suddenly, I was getting calls from random numbers, texts from unknown people. My landlord was texting me something about my lease being invalid. I couldn't even get my car to start. Garland had people who could shut it off remotely. And I think he used it. I got in a cab, feeling my phone buzz with messages and calls. It was all falling apart. I'd failed Garland, and he was pulling the rug out. I had some incriminating stuff on my home computer that I had to clear, but that was it. Just one little car ride, and that'd be that. About halfway to my place, the taxi stopped. It just pulled over by the side of the highway. The driver leaned back. "I'm on break," he said. "Supervisor said I'm taking a break." "You can't just... I gotta get home." "I'm on break." "But I gotta..." "On break." Didn't matter what I said. I was stranded. I got out, and the moment my feet touched the asphalt, he sped off. I was standing by the side of the highway, screaming at him to come back. It was already dark out, and all I saw were anonymous cars speeding past at 75 miles per hour. I could barely navigate anything on my phone. I kept getting pop-ups. They had devolved from messages to constant spam. My internet connection was down too. Garland was pulling out all the stops to show his disapproval. I managed to get to a diner further down the road. Old-timey place, meant for about 12 guests at most. There were a handful of other people there, mostly truckers. It sort of looked like a refurbished bus with the kitchen welded on. I hurried inside, asking if I could borrow a phone and call a cab. The two other guests followed me with their eyes, unsure what to make of me. The owner didn't seem to mind. She could tell I was having a rough day. She picked up a phone and dialed a number. I barely got time to sit down before I saw her expression change. Someone was calling her. I was probably being tracked. She turned to me, looking through a hole in the kitchen door. She shook her head and told me she was sorry. Moments later, she was out of the door, and the lights went out. 3 men entered the diner. The 2 truckers looked at them, then me, and promptly left. It had barely been a couple of minutes, and sure, I was stronger and healthier than ever, but I couldn't take on 3 people. As the front door closed, I heard the click of a telescope baton unfolding. For a moment, it was all quiet. I tried to make my case, slowly. "I couldn't get to it," I said. "I'm sorry." "Not good enough." One of them approached me, holding the baton toward me like a pointing stick. It poked against my chest. I could feel my heart beating through my clothes as if trying to push it away. "You want back in? You're gonna have to do better." "I'm out," I said. "I can't. I'm out." "You sure about that?" "I don't want to be a problem." The 3 men looked at one another. Getting a better view of them, I could see these were men deep in Garland's pockets. One had a neck like a bobblehead, similar to Rain. Another had these strange ticks from his arm all the way up to his eye. Some kind of nerve damage. And the third, the guy with the baton, his eyes were pale white, like he was supposed to be blind, but he clearly wasn't. "He's gonna ruin your life," the blind man said. "Ain't no question about it. He already has." The 3 of them gave each other a curious look, and I saw an opportunity. Their guard was down, and I had a clear shot to the front door. Neither of them had locked it. I had to go for it. I burst into a sprint, barely making it past the first 2 and pushing aside the third. I flew through the door, stumbling out into the parking lot gravel. There was a single light post overhead, casting the parking lot in long shadows. Another 12 or so people waited for me outside, some with crooked legs and backs, one woman with no lips, a man with an open gunshot wound to the neck. These weren't the people you'd see at the parties. These were the secret backbone that kept Garland and his group floating. These were the real broken necks, the people who brought in the money. One more ghoulish than the next, they circled around me with knives and guns. One guy was carrying a car battery and cables tossed over his shoulder. "Bad move," said the blind man. "Real bad move." I tried to run for it, but it was too late. I got grabbed, pushed back, and the circle tightened. Someone had a bad lung, making their laugh sound like a stalling engine. A baton strike to the back of my leg put me on the ground. It didn't matter what I said or what I promised. They weren't having it. These were people that, without Garland and his touch, they'd be dead, or worse. I was just a sellout with a bum leg. They'd done far worse to far better people. And they were going to do something far worse than just mess up my leg. I'm not going to go into detail on the 20-minute abuse I lived through. The cuts, the beatings, the gasoline waterboarding, all from a crowd of broken bodies, crooked smiles, and heaving laughter. I remember a darkness descending on me as my head desperately tried to carry blood back to my brain. I was dipping in and out of consciousness, waning back and forth between begging for it to end and hoping I could pull through, that some miracle would show itself. Instead, I heard Garland. As the beating stopped, his voice boiled its way into my blood-stained ear. "I could fix you, you know," he said. "If I did, I could put you right back here. That's a strong incentive." He stepped back. I heard the crowd compose itself, ready for anything. "But what's the point?" he sighed. "You're not trustworthy. You're nothing." He brushed some hair aside, and with that, he left. And through all the burning wounds and scathing clothes, I felt something in my leg. That everlasting, dull, throbbing nerve damage. True to his word, I was right back to where I started. One of the truckers who'd been at the diner had called the cops, but they conveniently only showed up after the beating was over. And from what little I heard through my swollen ears, they weren't really there to check on me. They were there from an anonymous tip, pointing me out as an insider in breach of contract. I was still in the hospital when I got the news. I lost everything. My job, my apartment, my car, my phone, my savings. Hell, even my freedom. Someone had served the prosecutor a case on a silver platter. 4 years was the best deal I could get. Nowadays, that life is behind me. It feels like yesterday, and the scars are still there. I know I messed up. I know a lot of this was my own doing, and I accept that. I'm being honest. I thought I could get away with it. When you're in that cloud, in that inner circle, it all just feels right. Not just physically, but socially. I've seen Rain a couple of times. She's back in her wheelchair. I don't think Garland appreciated her role as my sponsor, but she's not out of his good graces yet. She still has a job, and she refuses to talk to me. I think Garland is keeping her on a short leash, and if she does well, she might have a way back in. But me? I mean, I'm out. I don't know what the society does nowadays, and I'm not sure I want to. I don't want anything to do with that part of the world anymore. I guess I should be thankful that they didn't take me out completely. Maybe I'm worth more. As an example, the town I live in is small and quiet, the kind of place where you know nearly everyone's name and the sound of their voice. And here, where life moves slowly and everyone's path seems almost preordained, we have one custom that's unlike any other, a certainty that's part of our lives from the very beginning. From birth, each of us is given a date printed on a small certificate and signed by the town's doctor. It's the date we're expected to die. Most of us accept it without question and treat it almost like a birthday or a local holiday. Just a fact of life here in a town that values tradition and stability. That's how it's always been. You're born, you live, and you prepare for that final day when it comes. Some people throw big last day parties or take farewell road trips. Others, like me, keep things simple. The older you get, the more you find comfort in the routine and the little things. I'm Ethan, 45 years old, and my own death date is tomorrow. It's strange, perhaps, but I find myself calm about it, at peace even. I've had a good life here, a good job at the library, a small but loyal circle of friends, and a family who loves me. I've always known this day would come, and there's an odd kind of relief in knowing it's finally here. There's nothing left I feel I need to do. So tonight, the night before my death, I'm going through the motions with a quiet sort of dignity. I spent time with my family, not wanting to make a fuss. I shared a simple dinner, passed around old family albums, and laughed over the usual stories. We toasted to a life well lived, though I could see the glint of sadness in my sister's eyes. I reassured her with a small smile and a touch on the shoulder. This is just how things are here. We don't dwell on things. We don't overthink them. As the evening deepens, I find myself sitting alone in my room, boxing up sentimental odds and ends that had gone untouched for years. An old watch from my father, a few journals from my 20s, a dried bouquet from my high school dance. Each one is a part of a life that, in a way, feels complete now. There's no sense of dread, just the sense of the inevitability of a chapter drawing to a close as neatly as it began. Outside, the town is settling down, the usual quiet settling in as people close up shop, dim their lights, and ready themselves for bed. I close my eyes and take a deep breath, a final moment of reflection on everything and nothing in particular. In this town tomorrow, I think, will just be another day. I wake up with a start, surprised to feel the morning light spilling across the bed. There's a moment of disorientation as I lie there, still drowsy, half expecting something else, an afterlife maybe, or even a simple void. Instead, I feel the solid weight of the mattress, the crisp sheets beneath my fingers, and the smell of coffee drifting faintly from the kitchen. It's familiar, grounding, and yet unexpected. I'm still here. I sit up slowly, heart pounding as I look at the clock. 6:32 a.m. Then my phone just to confirm. The date, my death date, printed on my certificate since I was a child, has come and gone. But I'm still here, breathing, blinking in daylight. A wave of joy hits me. unbidden, like an electric surge. I'm alive. Somehow, I've outlived the date that was supposed to end my life. It feels miraculous, surreal, a second chance. After pacing around in shock, I reach for my phone and dial my sister. I hesitate, thumb hovering over a name, unsure how to explain something I barely understand. But I finally press call, my voice thick with a mix of excitement and disbelief as I tell her the news. At first, there was silence on the other end. I hear a gasp, then a shaky laugh. She's thrilled, but her voice has a hesitant edge, a hint of something I can't place. "But Ethan, how?" she whispers, as if she's afraid to ask. I don't have an answer. I laugh, assuring her I don't plan on looking a gift horse in the mouth. "Maybe it was just a mistake," I say, though I can hear the doubt in my own voice. My closest friends are equally baffled when I call them. Their response is a strange mix of joy and unease. There's a disconnect in their laughter, a sense of uncertainty. It's though I've broken a rule we've all lived by that has never been questioned. I can't quite shake the feeling that their joy isn't as genuine as I'd hoped. That afternoon, still riding the wave of my own survival, I decided to step outside, eager to reconnect with the world. But as I walk through my yard, something peculiar happens. I reach out to steady myself on a nearby tree trunk, and the bark beneath my palm seems to lose its colour, fading to a dull, lifeless grey. I pull my hand back, shaking off the odd sensation, telling myself it's just a dead spot on the tree. Later, I pick up my old watch, the one my father gave me, the one I'd packed away as a keepsake. The gold plating has somehow lost its shine, dulled and tarnished in a way it never was before. It strikes me as strange, but I laugh it off, attributing it to its age. Still, as I sit down to dinner, I can't ignore a nagging feeling that something's off. The food seems to taste a little bland, as if missing something. Objects around me seem to have lost their usual warmth, the colour around me feeling subtly muted. But I brush it off, telling myself it's just part of the adjustment. After all, I'm alive. This second chance, whatever it is a gift, a miracle. After the initial shock of survival wears off, life takes on a new, vivid sharpness. I can feel the warmth of every sunrise like it's painting my skin, scenes I took for granted before taking on a new meaning of hope. Each morning, I wake up with a renewed energy, savouring everything I'd once taken for granted. I thought my time was up, and suddenly it wasn't. So I dive in, determined to make the most of this uncharted time I've been given. There are small things, walking the trails just outside of town, which I'd neglected over the years, and trying out recipes with an enthusiasm I never had before, experimenting with spices just because I can. And there are bigger things. I reach out to old friends I'd lost touch with, join a few local clubs, and catch up on every little dream that seemed out of reach. For once, I feel like a man let out of a cage. People around town notice too, commenting on how I seem brighter, happier. And I am. But the brightness fades. Occasionally, I begin feeling drained, nagging exhaustion creeping in no matter how much I sleep. I'll be mid-conversation with a friend and feel like my thoughts are molasses, as if I had to push my words out against a strong wind. My surroundings grow dim, colours appear just a shade darker, and the air is subtly colder. It's subtle, like a shadow creeping just out of sight. One evening, I head to my sister's house for dinner, excited to catch up. She set the table with flowers, all brightly coloured and fresh, something she never does. But an hour into the meal, her face looks pale, a little drawn, and she keeps rubbing her temples, saying she feels unusually tired. The flowers seem to wilt during our meal, petals curling at the edges. She excuses herself early, and I leave feeling unsettled. The next time I visit, she opens the door slowly, greeting me with a hesitant smile that doesn't reach her eyes. She's more distant, her conversation guarded. By the time I leave, I feel a chill in my bones, like I walked out of a freezer. The odd occurrences continue. Electronics around me short out, flickering, then dying in my hands. My old television set gives out with a loud pop one night, the screen going black. Then my microwave, the radio, even my alarm clock, all fail one after the other. At first, I thought it was just bad luck, but when it happened to my phone, I couldn't ignore it anymore. People, too, started drifting away. Friends who were eager to spend time together grow quiet, cancelling plans or cutting conversations short. They tell me they feel off or uncomfortable, fidgeting as if they can't bear to stay near me. Even brief interactions leave them looking tired, distracted, and eager to leave. My sister stops inviting me over entirely, and when I call, her voice is distant, her words clipped. One day, I ran into an old friend, Joe, at the grocery store. We chat for a few minutes, laughing over an old story. But by the end, he looks exhausted. There's a pallor to his face, a sagging to his shoulders. He stammers something about needing to get going, and I watch him leave with a hollow feeling in my stomach. Back home, things get stranger still. Food in my fridge spoils within days, and fruit and vegetables turn soft and foul-smelling, even though they are well within their expiry date. I cook a meal, only to find it tasteless, no matter how well I prepare it. Even the water from my tap tastes stale and flat. Sitting in my silent living room one evening, I feel a profound sense of isolation, a silence pressing in like a weight. The plants droop in their pots, the light flickers overhead, and a gnawing dread settles deep in my stomach. I'm still alive, yes, but something is deeply, unnervingly wrong. As the days drag on, I start avoiding people, embarrassed and afraid of the effect I seem to have on them. My so-called second chance is becoming a curse, pushing everything and everyone away from me. The weight of what's happening settles over me slowly. I've gone over every possible explanation. Stress, coincidence, my own paranoia. Still, I can't ignore what's right before me anymore. The flowers, my food, my friends. They're all affected. Everything I come into contact with fades or dies, drained of its vitality. One morning, as I stare at my reflection in the bathroom mirror, I notice something unsettling in my own eyes. A shadow, an emptiness. I look older, more haggard, and my skin is paler. For a moment, I feel like a stranger is staring back at me, someone unnatural, a distortion of the man I used to be. I'm surviving, yes, but at a cost I didn't choose and don't want to accept. Desperate for clarity, I reach out to my closest friend, Tom. He's been there through it all, steady and reliable, a grounding force I need now more than ever. When we meet, I can tell he's hesitant, his usual ease replaced by an uncomfortable tension. Over coffee, I finally admit what's been happening, each word feeling heavier than the last. "Tom," I say, voice tight, "have you noticed anything strange since since I was supposed to—" The words trail off, and I watch his face carefully. To my relief, he doesn't brush me off. Instead, he takes a deep breath, looking almost relieved to be asked. "Honestly, Ethan, I have," he says, pausing as if weighing his words. "It's hard to explain, but I just feel different after seeing you. Things don't feel right. It's like something's off, like you're off, almost like you're out of sync with the rest of us." The words hit like a punch to the gut, and I can barely meet his gaze. But I couldn't help but appreciate his honesty. "So, you're saying—" I start, but he nods before I can finish. "Yeah, Ethan, I don't know how to say this, but it's almost like you're not supposed to be here." The silence between us is suffocating. I feel exposed, like I've been laid bare. The last shred of denial crumbles, and I realize that somehow surviving my death date has made me something unnatural. I'm living on borrowed time, but I didn't realize where I was borrowing it from. Tom doesn't say much more, but our discomfort grows palpable. He avoids my eyes, fidgeting with his hands, and finally he stands, mumbling something about needing to leave. His face is filled with a mixture of pity and fear, like he's afraid I might have taken more from him just by sitting here. He doesn't look back when he leaves, and I know deep down that I've lost him, my oldest, closest friend. As he walks away, I feel a hollowness settle in, gnawing and cold. I don't just feel like an outcast. I am one. Back at home, the isolation sets in. I've been given this second chance, but seemingly at the cost of everyone and everything around me. My presence has become toxic. Plants wither. My home feels more like a crypt than a sanctuary, and the silence presses in on me, heavier than ever. Days pass, each one lonelier than the last. I avoid everyone, neighbors, friends, family, out of fear of what my presence might do to them. I don't even open my windows, terrified of birds or stray animals, anything living that might come close enough to feel the drain. My house becomes a self-imposed prison, a quiet place where I exist in solitude, haunted by the life I'm unintentionally living. What was once a miraculous second chance has become a slow, consuming curse. I'd once looked forward to each day, grateful for the unexpected time I'd been given. Now, I dread every moment, every step, every breath, wondering how much I'll take from the world around me just by being here. The days blur together, every hour more suffocating than the last. I pace the length of my small house, fighting against the weight pressing in on me. I try to rationalize it. Maybe it's a psychological trick, a dark corner of my mind manifesting this nightmare to punish me. But I know it's real each time I pass a mirror, catch the drawn hollows under my eyes, or feel the oppressive quiet hanging heavy around me. My presence is a poison, a drain on the life around me. I can't stay. I can't keep letting this curse bleed into the people I once loved. In a flash of desperation, I decide to leave town and go as far away as possible. Maybe distance will break whatever connection has turned me into this thing. I throw clothes into a bag, grab my keys, and shove open the door, practically running to my car. But the escape doesn't come easy. The car sputters to a stop barely 2 miles down the road, the engine wheezing and coughing before it dies completely. I sit there, slumped over the wheel, fighting the urge to scream. I call for a tow, waiting under the heavy sun as it drains the little energy I have. But the driver who arrives seems put off. He barely looks at me as he fixes the car, muttering something about my bad luck. I brush it off, impatient, desperate. The repairs hold just long enough for me to reach the edge of town. I feel a moment of relief as I see the highway stretch before me, endless, a way out of this nightmare. But as soon as I try pull onto the road, the car shudders, lurches, and dies once again. It won't start back up. Defeated, I lock up and start walking, determined to leave on foot if necessary. Hitchhiking, however, proves impossible. Car after car whizzes, drivers looking at me with a strange mix of pity and unease, their eyes darting away when I catch their gaze. A bus pulls up at a stop near the edge of town, but the driver waves me off, barely glancing at me, muttering something about not wanting trouble. It's like everyone knows somehow that I don't belong. Hours pass, and the hopelessness grows, gnawing at me like a festering wound. By evening, I'm back where I started, exhausted at the edge of town, every attempt blocked by either mechanical failure or the strange, unspoken refusal of others to help. It's like an invisible force is binding me here, not with magic, but with sick twists of fate. I stumble back to my house, shoulders slumped, every step feeling like a weight pulling me deeper into the earth. Inside, the silence greets me, heavy, hollow, and suffocating. It's clearer than ever now. There is no leaving. I've exhausted every option, clinging to hope like a man drowning. But hope has abandoned me, leaving only questions I'm done living with. So, I go to the only person who might understand the impossible. The town's oracle is a quiet, reserved woman in her 70s, rumoured to know secrets no one else dares speak of. She's lived here as long as anyone can remember, her presence a fixture as familiar as the buildings themselves. People say she can see the threads of life and death, that she knows things about each of us that we could never know ourselves. The air feels thick as I approach her home, the last place I can go for any sort of clarity. She answers the door before I even knock, as if she's expecting me, and gestures for me to follow her inside. Her home is dim, filled with the smell of old books and faint incense. There's a stillness here, something that feels eternal, as though time has no place in her world. "Please," I say, my voice cracking, "you have to help me. I need to understand. Why did I survive? Why am I like this?" My desperation spills out in words that tumble over each other, jagged with raw need. The oracle regards me with a quiet, unreadable expression. She listens patiently, her eyes filled with a kind of ancient sadness, as though she'd heard every version of this plea before. After a long silence, she speaks, her voice low and steady, almost like she's speaking to herself. Death dates are a part of a balance here, Ethan. Each date holds a purpose, a thread in the fabric of life that keeps this town steady. To survive beyond that, it's to unravel that balance. By living past your time, you're pulling from the world around you, feeding on the life that's meant for others. You're not meant to be here. Her words are like a slow, cold current washing over me. So, I am draining them, I whisper, barely able to keep my voice steady. She nods, her expression unwavering. Yes, every moment you remain, others in this town feel it. They lose pieces of themselves, pieces that go to sustain you. That is the price of escaping death. To live, you borrow. You've been borrowing from those around you, their vitality slowly siphoning into you. A sick realization settles in, chilling me to the bone. I felt the fading light in my friend's eyes, the way they've grown wary, distant. I was right to feel like a parasite, and this confirmation is a weight that threatens to crush me. I lower my head, unable to meet her gaze. Is there any way to stop it? I manage, the words barely more than a whisper. The oracle studies me carefully, then nods. There is one way, but it requires surrender. The only way to end this, Ethan, is to restore what was taken, to give back the life you borrowed. You must accept your death as it was meant to be, willingly, to let the balance correct itself. The finality in her voice sinks deep. I fought so hard to stay alive, clinging to each second, each breath. And now I'm being asked to let it go. I feel a strange calm settling in, resignation mingling with a heavy sorrow that tugs at my chest. I nod, swallowing the lump in my throat. I understand. She places a gentle hand on my shoulder, her touch warm and grounding, and hands me a vial of liquid. She didn't have to tell me what it was. Take the time you need to say goodbye, Ethan. Then, when you're ready, return to where you should have left. I leave her house feeling lighter, yet burdened by a sadness that words can't touch. This isn't just an ending. Now it's a choice, a sacrifice that holds more weight than anything I've ever known. That night, I sat alone in my home, pen and paper in hand. I write letters to those I've loved, the friends I've lost. I don't try to explain everything. How could I? Instead, I apologize and offer gratitude and love, hoping they'll somehow understand the heart behind them. I write one to my sister, telling her I'm sorry for everything I took from her, for the shadow I brought into her life. Each letter is a small act of surrender, a step toward letting go. When I finish, I seal the envelopes and leave them on the table, my last quiet gift to the life I'm finally ready to release. I close my eyes, the silence around me feeling less like a poison and more like peace. I'm ready to restore the balance, to return what I've borrowed, and to embrace the end as it was meant to be. I stand at the threshold of my home, gazing over the town one last time. I break open the vial and gulp its contents. There's a quietness now, a stillness in my mind that I haven't felt since this whole nightmare began. As I step forward, the familiar streets seem to blur, fading into the first light of dawn. Each step draws something out of me, a gentle and final release. I feel the weight lift, like the burden I've carried is finally letting go, piece by piece. The air grows lighter, as if the town is exhaling, filling with the life I've held captive in my skin. I keep walking, the drain growing deeper as I leave the last bounds of the town. I barely feel the ground beneath my feet, the final energy fragments slipping from me as I cross into open fields. My pulse slows, steady and calm, each beat softer than the last. Around me, the world settles back into what it once was. The trees stand a little taller, the light grows a little brighter, and the quiet murmur of the town's waking hours stirs to life behind me. The sense of pressure I once drained from the others feels restored and whole, as if my departure was what the town needed all along. I glance back, catching the faint outlines of familiar places, and I feel a wave of peace, knowing I'm leaving things as they were meant to be. Faces flash in my mind. My sister's laughter, Tom's quiet smile, the warmth of friends I held dear. They're safe now, free from the pull of my unintended curse. As my breath fades, I know I'm no longer part of this world, but rather a quiet echo, something gentle in the background. I linger only as a whisper, a brief warmth felt by those I loved most, no more than a faint memory, a reminder that I was once here. And in this quiet surrender, I finally find peace, restored to the balance of things as they were always meant to be. The snow under our boots crunched sharply as we trudged towards Station Polaris, the isolated Arctic research outpost where we were sent to investigate. The wind howled relentlessly, biting through our thermal suits and filling the air with a low, mournful wail that matched the stark emptiness of the frozen landscape. This wasn't the place for mistakes, but the station's sudden silence had dragged us here, hundreds of miles from anything resembling civilization. The research station, set up to collect data in the Arctic, went quiet, so we were sent to investigate. It could have been the result of the power going out, a problem with the communications array, or an encounter with wildlife. So we had to prepare for anything. We set off, equipped for a long mission with supplies to last us days. The station loomed ahead, its angular structure almost blending into the stark white surroundings. Solar panels glinted dully under the weak Arctic sun, and the wind turbine blades creaked as they turned sluggishly. The comms array stood tall, perfectly intact. From the outside, everything seemed functional, yet we all knew that no one had heard a word from the researchers in weeks. Inside, the facility was eerily pristine. The lights hummed softly and the heaters were working perfectly. Supplies were neatly stacked in the pantry and the living quarters were immaculate. It felt like the crew could walk in at any moment, but the air carried a stale weight as though the building itself had been holding its breath. Then, we found them. Their bodies were huddled in the secure lab, the thick steel door latched from the inside. It took us a full hour to breach it, cutting through the locks with a plasma torch. When the door finally swung open, the scene was haunting. 4 researchers were slumped against the walls, their gaunt faces frozen in twisted expressions of fear. Their lab coats were rumpled and stained, and deep scratches marred the walls and door. A few words were sprawled on the inside of the door in what looked like dried blood. "Don't open." Their hands, raw and bloody, suggested desperate attempts to claw their way out, or maybe to keep something from getting in. The food stores were untouched, and the air recyclers were working perfectly, yet the cause of death was clear: dehydration and starvation. They'd locked themselves inside and never left. "Cabin fever?" Eliza, our biologist, whispered, her voice trembling slightly despite her usual calm. "Maybe they thought something was out there?" I replied, glancing nervously toward the hallway. We fanned out, each of us taking a section of the station to begin our work. I focused on the comms array, which appeared functional but was inexplicably offline. The software log showed no errors, as if someone had deliberately disabled it. The station's pristine condition clashed violently with the madness of the locked lab. Every door swung on oiled hinges, every panel gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and even the smallest tool was in its proper place. The perfection of the setting only made it feel more unsettling, the dichotomy of the situation painting a grim mystery to be solved. Then, there was the feeling. It wasn't something we could measure or explain, but we all felt it. A subtle, pervasive wrongness. The air seemed heavier inside, charged with an energy that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. Even the wind outside seemed muted, as though the station absorbed every sound. It didn't help that the Arctic stretched endlessly beyond the walls, a blank canvas of snow and ice that could swallow us whole if we made the wrong step. But it wasn't the landscape that had me glancing over my shoulder. It was the silence inside. Something about it felt alive. I tried to focus on my tasks, but my mind kept circling back to the locked room, to those faces frozen in terror. What had they seen that drove them to such desperation? And what if it was still here? The question hung in the air like frost, unanswered and growing colder with each passing moment. The first few hours at Station Polaris were chaotic, a frantic attempt to make sense of the fragmented research left behind. Environmental readings from the station sensors were erratic, subtle, rhythmic vibrations in the air, logged at precise intervals. These weren't seismic in nature. The station's ground-penetrating radar showed no signs of tectonic activity. Instead, it was as if the air itself pulsed with energy, but only fleetingly. Every time we tried to pinpoint the anomaly, the readings vanished as quickly as they'd appeared. "This doesn't make sense," Eliza said, poring over the data console. She tapped at the screen, frustration mounting. "It's like the equipment's playing tricks on us." "Could be interference from the storm outside," Mark offered, the team's communication officer, though his tone lacked conviction. He'd already noticed the radios crackling with faint static. Still, he wasn't ready to alarm us with the implications of it. The strangeness escalated within hours. While conducting inventory in the common area, Eliza froze mid-step. "Did you hear that?" "Hear what?" Mark asked, glancing up from the checklist. "There was knocking from the other side of the main door," Eliza said, her voice wavering. Mark walked to the door, shining his flashlight into the white expanse beyond the narrow window. Nothing but the swirling void of the Arctic night greeted him. "It's the wind," he said, though he didn't sound fully convinced. While exploring, I returned from inspecting the living quarters, pale as ice. "I swear I heard my name," I muttered, "but it wasn't you two, was it?" "No," Eliza replied quickly, her eyes darting to the shadows flickering under the fluorescent lights. "And I heard something else." Each of us reported hearing different sounds: muffled sobbing, distant tapping, voices murmuring indistinct words. None could verify what the others heard, and no auditory signals appeared on their monitoring equipment. The incongruity heightened the unease, as if the station itself were conspiring to disorient us. While searching the primary lab, I found a compartment hidden behind one of the equipment racks. Its lid was engraved with strange, almost geometric patterns, unfamiliar to any of us. Inside lay a crystalline object about the size of a grapefruit. It refracted light in unsettling ways, casting disoriented, shifting shadows on the walls. "What is this?" I murmured, reaching to touch it. "Careful," Eliza warned, but curiosity got the better of me. As my fingertips grazed the object, a sharp jolt rippled through my hand. I pulled back, cursing. The room seemed to hum for a moment before falling silent. "Did you feel that?" Mark asked, rubbing his temples. He described a faint whisper, barely audible, that lingered in the back of his mind, like a half-forgotten memory trying to surface. The object's presence deepened our sense of foreboding. Attempts to analyze it proved fruitless. No material analysis equipment on site could identify its composition, and it emitted no radiation or heat signature. It was completely inert, yet profoundly wrong. Eliza suggested the previous team might have unearthed it nearby. Still, there was no mention of the object in the research logs. "Whatever this is," she said, "it isn't supposed to be here." Later that evening, we gathered in the comms room to send an update to the logistics crew. Mark activated the satellite relay, waiting for the encryption sequence to process. The screen displayed a reassuring green connection icon, which flickered and then went black. "Not now," he muttered, rebooting the system. Static hissed from the speakers, followed by the faint hum of a transmission. For a brief moment, the green icon reappeared, only to be replaced by garbled static and a faint, rhythmic pulse. Mark tried to readjust the signal gain, but it was futile. "Is it the storm?" Eliza asked, but Mark shook his head. "We've transmitted through worse weather. This feels deliberate." The equipment continued to falter throughout the night. By morning, the comm system had failed entirely. I worked furiously and attempted a hard reset but achieved nothing. "We're on our own," I finally admitted. As night descended, the whispers became louder and more insistent. Eliza tried to sleep but was jolted awake. She said it was a voice, a clear, commanding whisper that seemed to come from inside her room. "Don't open the door," it said. But when she bolted upright, her door was shut and the room empty. In the mess hall, Mark sat alone, staring at his radio. He swore the static was speaking to him, patterns emerging in the crackles. "Don't you hear it?" he asked when I entered. "Hear what?" I asked. But before Mark could respond, the main hallway lights flickered, casting jagged shadows across the walls. For a split second, we all felt it, A crushing presence, like something immense and unseen, was bearing down on us. The sense of being watched grew unbearable. By now, none of us doubted the previous researchers' writings on the door. The whispers gnawed at the edges of our sanity. Looking at the others, I was the steadiest among them, and I finally addressed the elephant in the room. Whatever's happening here, we can't stay. If we're not careful, we'll end up just like them. The air inside the station felt heavier with each passing hour. I couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were watching us. Eliza paced back and forth near the common area, her footsteps echoing unnaturally loud. "This place is all wrong," she muttered, glancing at the reinforced windows. Mark stared out at the snow through one of the thick panes. "Nothing but white," he said softly, almost to himself. "No movement, no sign of life. It's just nothing." I sat at the console, scrolling through the fragmented logs. "There's nothing here that explains the last team's behavior," I said. "No seismic anomalies, no animal sightings, no storms, just normal readings." I felt the words catch in my throat, because nothing felt normal here. Eliza stopped pacing to turn to me. "Then what drove them mad? They scratched the doors to pieces, barricaded themselves inside, and starved to death. That doesn't just happen." I had no answer. That night, the station woke us with sounds. It started faint, scratching on the far wall, just loud enough to break through the silence. I sat upright in my bunk, heart pounding. At first, I thought it was the wind. Then came the banging, sharp and deliberate, like something heavy striking metal. "Eliza, did you hear that?" I whispered, grabbing my flashlight. "Yeah," she said, her voice trembling. "It might just be, I don't know, ice shifting." Mark had already slid out of his bunk and was standing in the doorway, staring down the hallway toward the source of the sound. "That's not ice," he said flatly. The banging came again, this time louder, closer. I jumped, my flashlight beam jittering against the wall. We gathered in the common area, clutching whatever we could find. Eliza grabbed a fire extinguisher. I held a wrench. Mark had his flashlight gripped like a weapon. The noise moved, circling the station. It came from the walls, then the roof, then the floor. Each sound was precise and deliberate, like it was searching for a weak spot. "It's testing us," Eliza said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's trying to find a way in." When dawn came, if you could call it that in the Arctic, the banging stopped. The station fell silent, but the tension in the air didn't fade. Mark suggested we check the perimeter and see if something left tracks, but I immediately vetoed the idea. "We don't know what's out there," I said. "It could be anything." "Like what? A polar bear?" Mark snapped. "Polar bears don't knock in patterns," Eliza shot back. "Whatever it is, it's not an animal." We barricaded the doors and windows. Every logical part of me knew we were trapping ourselves inside, but I couldn't bring myself to suggest otherwise. The noises, whatever was out there, had made that choice for us. The second night was worse. The scratching became relentless scraping, like claws dragging against the walls. The banging came back, harder and more chaotic, shaking the station to its core. "It's going to break through," Eliza whispered, clutching the fire extinguisher like a lifeline. Mark sat at the console, staring at the monitors. "There's nothing," he said, his voice shaking. "The cameras show nothing. It's just us out here." "Then what the hell is making that noise?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. "I don't know," Mark snapped, slamming his fist on the console. The banging immediately responded, echoing louder, sharper, almost angry. We all froze. "It heard that," Eliza said softly. "It heard him." By the third day, we were all exhausted. Every step felt like trudging through wet cement. Eliza slumped in a chair, her face pale. "I can't think straight," she said, her voice barely audible. "Yeah," Mark agreed, his head in his hands. "I need more sleep. It's like my energy's just gone." I rubbed my temples, trying to fight off the pounding headache that had been building all morning. The artifact. I didn't want to admit it, but I knew it was somehow involved. "It could be the artifact," I said finally, putting the idea out there. "We should throw it outside," Mark muttered. "And risk leaving the station?" I asked. "Do you hear that?" The banging had started again, now accompanied by a low, almost mechanical groan. The third night, everything reached a fever pitch. The station shook with the force of the banging, and the scraping became a deafening screech. Eliza dropped to her knees, covering her ears. "It's in my head," she screamed. "It's in my goddamn head." Mark grabbed his flashlight and bolted toward the far hallway. "We can't just sit here and wait to die. I'm gonna kill it," he shouted, his flashlight beam cut through the darkness, landing on the door at the far end of the station. The banging stopped. "Mark, don't..." I started, but he was already at the door, his hand trembling as he reached for the handle. The silence was deafening. "It's quiet," he whispered, his voice cracking. Eliza and I rushed forward, getting ready to grab him. "Don't open it," I yelled. "It's a trap." Mark hesitated, his hand still inches from the handle. Then the banging resumed, louder than ever, as if mocking us. We stumbled back to the common area, the sounds chasing us, filling the station with chaos. The station wasn't just falling apart. We were. By the fourth day, the noises had escalated to a maddening cacophony, banging, scratching, and now an eerie, rhythmic thumping that echoed deep within the walls. The air inside felt like it was pressing against my skull, and every glance exchanged among us seemed to carry unspoken accusations. Mark and Eliza sat opposite ends of the common area, glaring at each other. I stood between them, exhausted from trying to keep the peace. "We can't keep doing this," I said, my voice hoarse from days of shouting over the sounds. "We need to work together, or we're not going to make it." "You want to talk about working together?" Eliza snapped, her eyes blazing. "Mark's the one who almost opened the goddamn door." "I was trying to figure out what we're dealing with," Mark shot back, slamming his fist on the table. "Sitting here, hiding, isn't solving anything." "Enough," I barked, slamming the wrench I'd been clutching onto the table. The sound reverberated through the station, momentarily drowning out the noises. For a brief moment, everything was silent. Then, as if in retaliation, the banging resumed, harder, angrier. Mark stood up. "You said it was the artifact. If it's causing this, why haven't we gotten rid of it?" "Because it's the only thing keeping us alive," she yelled back. "You think these noises are bad? Imagine what happens if we just throw it out there with whatever's out there. It must want it. I turned to Eliza, raising my hands. We don't know that for sure, but right now we can't risk... The crash of shattering glass cut me off. My heart stopped as I turned and saw Mark standing over the console, a chair raised in his hands. He'd smashed the screen, shards of glass glittering on the floor. Smoke rose from the panel as sparks danced across its surface. "What the hell are you doing?" I shouted, lunging for him. I grabbed his arm and yanked him back as the equipment groaned and fizzled. "It wasn't doing anything," he screamed, his voice cracking. "It wasn't calling anyone. It wasn't helping. It's just another useless piece of junk, like all of you." Smoke poured out from the console as the last of its lights flickered out. The satellite uplink was fried, and the backup comms were destroyed. We were completely isolated now, with no way to call for help or even confirm if rescue was coming. "You've doomed us," Eliza shrieked, her voice shaking with rage and panic. She shoved Mark, sending him tumbling backward. "Do you even understand what you've done?" "I did what I had to," Mark spat, clutching the chair like a shield. "None of this was working. We're on our own whether you like it or not. Now we can finally focus on the here and now." I stood between them, my body tense, my mind racing. We needed that console. Now we have nothing left. Mark turned to me, his face pale and eyes bloodshot. "Nothing? We've had nothing since we got here, Reed. The noises aren't stopping, the artifact isn't doing anything, and now we're just sitting ducks. You want to die locked in here like those researchers?" The words hung in the air like frost, chilling us all. I saw Eliza's face crumble as the gravity of our situation sank in. Mark lowered his chair, his rage deflating to quiet despair. But it was too late. The noises stopped. For a moment, the station fell into an oppressive silence, the kind that made my ears ring. Then came a sound worse than any banging or scratching. A low, guttural moan, vibrating through the walls and deep into my bones. "It's trying to get in," she whispered. "It's going to break through." "No," I said firmly, though my own fear was clawing at my throat. "It's not going to get in. It hasn't gotten in yet, and it won't now. We just have to hold out." "Why do you keep saying that?" Mark demanded, stepping closer. His face was pale, his eyes bloodshot. "You don't know that. For all we know, it's already inside." "It's not inside," I insisted, my voice rising. "But it will be if we start losing it like the last team did." Mark froze at that, his face darkening. "You think we're like them?" he hissed. "You think we're just going to sit here and starve ourselves to death like they did?" "Mark, calm down," I said, stepping back. "No," he shouted. "You're just as bad as they were, refusing to face the truth. There's something out there, and if we don't deal with it..." The lights flickered again, and the temperature plummeted. Frost began forming on the windows, creeping inward. The artifact's glow pulsed erratically, casting wild shadows on the walls. The banging reached a fever pitch, drowning out Mark's words. Mark lunged for the artifact. "If we're going to die here, I'm not going to sit here and..." Eliza tackled him before he could reach it, both of them collapsing to the floor in a heap. The wrench fell from my hand as I rushed to pull them apart, but the moment my fingers touched Mark's arm, I felt it. The same draining sensation I'd felt near the artifact, only stronger. "Stop it!" I yelled, yanking him back. He shoved me off, breathing heavily, but didn't move toward the artifact again. The groaning noise didn't stop. It pulsed through the station. Mark and Eliza clung to each other as if their sheer presence could hold the station together. I stayed where I was, gripping my wrench, my mind racing to make sense of it all. But then, I noticed something odd. My coffee mug. It sat on the table, untouched since the morning, but the liquid inside was perfectly still. No ripples, no trembling surface. "Eliza," I croaked, pointing to the mug. "Look at this." She didn't move, her hands pressed to her ears. Mark shook his head, his back pressed to the wall. "Not now, Reed. We need to figure out how to survive whatever the hell that is." "Eliza, Mark," I said louder, standing up and pointing more firmly at the mug. "The sound. It's not real." They both froze, looking at me like I'd lost my mind. "What are you talking about?" Eliza said, her voice tight. "You can feel it." I grabbed the mug and held it up. "This should be shaking. Everything should be vibrating, but nothing in this room is reacting to the sound, except us." Mark's eyes darted to the mug, and for a moment, doubt flickered across his face, but it was quickly replaced by defiance. "That doesn't mean anything. Maybe the noise is coming from inside. Maybe the whole structure is shifting. Then why haven't we felt a single tremor? Why are the vents still circulating air without a hitch?" My voice was growing louder, fueled by desperation. "The noises are in our heads. Whatever is causing this, it's keeping us trapped here, keeping us afraid." Eliza shook her head violently, her fingers tightening around her temples. "That doesn't make sense. What about the artifact? The noises started after we found it. How can you say this isn't real?" "It is real," I said, "but only in here." I tapped the side of my head. "It's making us paranoid. It made the researchers paranoid enough to lock themselves in that lab and starve to death, and it's doing the same thing to us." Mark stared at me, his face pale but resolute. "So what? You think we should just open the door and stroll outside? Let whatever's out there finish us off?" "Yes," I said, surprising even myself with the strength of my conviction. "That's exactly what we need to do. If we stay here, it will wear us down until we're like them. Those bodies aren't warnings. They're proof of what happens if we don't get out." Eliza backed away, her eyes wide. "You're insane. You want to open the door to whatever's been banging and growling? You want to kill us all." "No, I want to survive," I shouted. "If we stay here, we end up like them. Don't you see? The sounds, the artifact. It's all a trap. It's making us seal ourselves inside, just like they did." Mark stepped forward, his fists clenched. "And what if you're wrong? What if we open that door and whatever's out there tears us apart? How are you so sure this isn't just cabin fever or some kind of environmental thing?" I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "Because I feel it. The moment I realized the sound wasn't real, it stopped for me. The whispers, the banging, I don't hear them anymore. But you do, don't you? It's still in your head, pushing you to stay." Eliza was trembling, her back pressed against the wall. "Even if you're right, Reed, we can't take that chance. We're not opening that door." Mark stepped between me and the entrance, his stance rigid. "You're not gonna let that thing in. You want to go out there? Fine. But you're not dragging us with you." The tension in the room was unbearable, the air thick with fear and mistrust. I gritted my teeth, my gaze shifting between them and the sealed door. The banging started again, or at least I assumed so, from how they reacted, as if it knew what I was about to do, making them more defensive and ready to hold the line at the door. "Get out of my way," I said quietly. Mark shook his head. "Over my dead body." Eliza's hand gripped my arm like a vice. "He's right. You don't know what's out there." I shook her off, my mind racing. What I do know is whatever's out there hasn't broken in. Not yet. And if I'm right, then we've been locking ourselves in here for no reason, just like the last team. You're gambling all our lives on some theory? What if you're wrong? Mark stepped closer, blocking my path to the door. His body was trembling. "I might be," I admitted, my voice cracking. "But look at us. We're not going to survive here much longer anyway. The power's unstable, we've lost comms, the cold's creeping in. If we stay, we die." Mark's jaw tightened. "Better than opening that door and letting whatever's out there tear us apart." Eliza stood behind him, wide-eyed, shaking her head. "Please, Reed, don't do this." Their fear was palpable, their desperation infectious. And yet, so was mine. The scratches, the banging, none of it left any evidence. Every sound vanished into the void, leaving nothing but frayed nerves in its wake. I glanced at the faint bloodstains near the lab's door where the previous team had met their end. They hadn't opened the door. They'd listened to the whispers, and they died because of it. I stepped closer to the door, heart hammering in my chest. The control panel blinked steadily, a quiet rhythmic reminder that I held the power to end this madness. Or to doom us all. "You're insane," Mark hissed. I heard him lurch forward and felt the impact as he grabbed my shoulder and yanked me away from the panel. I twisted out of his grip, shoving him hard enough to make him stumble. The sound of his boots scraping against the floor echoed loudly in the still air. He caught himself and turned back to me, rage flashing in his eyes. "Don't make me stop you," he said, his voice trembling. I stared him down, my hand creeping back toward the panel. "I don't think you can." Mark lunged at me again, this time with more force. I managed to sidestep him, slamming my back against the wall near the panel. Eliza cried out behind him, her voice cracking as she begged both of us to stop. But the door's blinking red light held my focus. I swung my arm out, swiping the control panel with the heel of my hand. The red light blinked once, twice, and then turned green. "No!" Mark roared, diving at me. But it was too late. The sound of the lock disengaging was deafening in the eerie silence. The door shuddered, its seals releasing with a hiss of escaping air. Eliza screamed, scrambling to grab Mark, who was clawing his way toward me as if to undo what I'd just done. I braced myself, every muscle locked in anticipation. The noise inside the station didn't stop. It collapsed. The incessant banging, scratching and whispers vanished instantly, replaced by the howling wind and the Arctic's suffocating stillness. The transition was so abrupt, it felt like stepping from a nightmare into nothingness. No shadowy figures, no claw marks, no monstrous forms, just the stark, blinding white of the snow and the faint howl of the wind. I exhaled, my breath fogging the air in front of me. "It's empty," I whispered. Mark froze mid-step, his face a mask of disbelief. Eliza slumped to her knees, her hands covering her face. For a moment, we all stood there, staring into the unbroken expanse of snow. The silence was crushing, not a single sound echoing back from the icy void. "There's nothing," I whispered, my words stolen by the wind. Mark looked at me, his face pale and drawn. "You don't know that," he muttered weakly, his voice hollow. I stepped toward the open door, the cold biting into my skin. "Then why did it stop?" He had no answer. Neither did I. Eliza stepped forward, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. Her face was pale, her eyes wide as she scanned the empty expanse. "So what? We imagined it? All of it?" "No," I said, my voice trembling but resolute. "Not imagined. It was real, just not the way we thought." Mark snapped. "You don't know that. It could be hiding. You could have killed us." His voice cracked, raw with anger and fear. "We don't know what's out there. We don't—" He faltered, his gaze drawn to the stark, unbroken snow. The reality began to sink in. The artifact, dull and inert in the corner, caught my eye. Its presence felt heavier now, an ominous void sucking in light and reason. I gestured toward it. "It was never out there," I said. "It was always here. That thing, whatever it is, wanted us locked in, panicking, tearing each other apart. And we almost gave it what it wanted." Mark's face twisted in denial, but Eliza's expression softened. She looked back at the artifact, her brow furrowing. "The other team," she murmured, her voice almost lost in the wind. "That's why we found them like that, with no sign of escape." I nodded, grimly. I stepped fully outside, letting the Arctic cold claw at my face, grounding me in its unrelenting reality. Behind me, Mark slumped into a chair, shaking his head in disbelief. Eliza stood at the threshold, her expression a mixture of relief and devastation. Mark remained inside as we began to salvage what we could, avoiding our gaze. His distrust was palpable. There was nothing I could say to ease it. We were alive, but we'd barely escaped with our sanity intact. The whispers didn't return, but the artifact remained in the corner of the lab. Every time I looked at it, I felt a faint unease, like it was still watching, waiting. Even though the Arctic wind roared around us, the silence inside the station had never felt louder. Evacuation finally arrived 2 days later. A helicopter's distant hum sliced through the icy silence, the sound alien after the oppressive stillness we had endured. By then, we'd cleared the station of what we could. Notes, data, anything that didn't feel tainted by the artifact. Mark stayed withdrawn, barely speaking a word since the door had opened. He avoided looking at Eliza or me, his eyes lingering on the artifact, as though it was still whispering to him. I caught him pacing in front of it late at night, his face blank but his movements frantic, like he was arguing with himself. As a group, we decided to hide the artifact away from the facility in an unmarked location so that even we couldn't find it. We had witnessed what it could do in the most remote location from civilization. We didn't dare imagine what it could do in a populated area. When the research team arrived, they asked about the station's state. I told them we had lost our equipment and that the previous crew had succumbed to madness. I didn't mention the artifact, and neither did Mark or Eliza. Back at the main base, I tried to write my report. Facts, observations, timelines. I stuck to the tangible, but the words felt hollow. How could I describe something so intangible, so invasive, without sounding insane? Eliza sat across from me, staring at her own blank page. Finally, she sighed and leaned back, her eyes hollow. "Are we supposed to pretend it didn't happen?" she asked. I didn't answer. I didn't know how. Mark refused to leave his quarters. He hadn't spoken since we boarded the helicopter. His door remained locked, the faint hum of his portable radio the only sign he was inside. I wondered if he still heard the whispers. Back in civilization, I tried to move on. Eliza transferred to a quieter project in a warmer climate, far from the Arctic. Mark disappeared entirely. Rumours floated among colleagues. He'd left the field, joined some obscure sect, or simply vanished. None of them felt right. None of them felt wrong. And me? I stayed. I couldn't let go of what we'd found, or what had found us. I researched phenomena like it, buried in obscure archives, piecing together scraps of folklore and fringe science. Each time I read about strange sounds, mass paranoia, or unexplainable events, my thoughts returned to the artifact, to the whispers, to the door.